The ancient city of Ashur emerged from the dusty plains of northern Mesopotamia sometime around 2500 BC, its mud brick walls rising along the western bank of the Tigris River at a point where the waterway curves dramatically eastward. This strategic location, approximately 350 kilometers north of Babylon, would prove instrumental in shaping the destiny of what would become one of history's most formidable civilizations. The site itself occupied a limestone outcrop that provided both natural fortification and elevation above the surrounding floodplains, offering commanding views of the river traffic that would become the lifeblood of Assyrian commerce. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the 20th century have revealed that the earliest inhabitants of Ashur were likely Semitic-speaking peoples who established their settlement during the latter part of the early dynastic period. The city's position along the Tigris was no accident. It sat at the confluence of several crucial trade arteries that connected the mineral-rich highlands of Anatolia with the agricultural heartlands of southern Mesopotamia. Copper from the Taurus Mountains, silver from the Anatolian Plateau, and precious stones from distant lands all passed through Ashur's gates, creating wealth that would fund the city's gradual expansion and fortification. The early Assyrians demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their choice of location, positioning themselves to control not only river traffic but also the overland routes that skirted the eastern edges of the Syrian desert. Caravans laden with goods from as far west as the Mediterranean coast and as far east as the Iranian plateau found Ashur to be an indispensable way station. The city's merchants developed sophisticated systems for managing this flow of commerce, establishing warehouses, standardizing weights and measures, and creating networks of trusted agents who could facilitate trade across vast distances. The transition from a simple trading post to a distinct cultural entity becomes apparent through careful examination of archaeological evidence from Tel al-Rimah and other contemporary sites in the region. Tel al-Rimah, located roughly 100 kilometers southwest of Ashur, provides crucial insights into the broader cultural transformation occurring across northern Mesopotamia during this period. Excavations at the site have uncovered pottery sequences that clearly demonstrate the gradual shift from Sumerian-influenced ceramic traditions to distinctly local styles that would later be recognized as characteristically Assyrian. The pottery found in the earliest levels at Tel al-Rimah exhibits the typical features of early dynastic Mesopotamian ceramics: thin-walled vessels with geometric patterns and the distinctive scarlet-painted decorations favoured by Sumerian craftsmen. However, as archaeologists traced the stratigraphy upward through successive occupation layers, they observed a marked evolution in both form and decoration. The later pottery displays thicker walls, more angular profiles, and increasingly abstract decorative motifs that diverge significantly from southern Mesopotamian traditions. This ceramic evidence reflects broader changes in material culture that were occurring throughout the region. Metal objects recovered from early Assyrian sites show similar patterns of development, with bronze implements and weapons displaying increasingly sophisticated manufacturing techniques and distinctive stylistic features. The metalworkers of early Ashur developed particular expertise in producing ceremonial axes and mace heads, objects that would later become symbols of royal authority in the mature Assyrian state. Seal impressions found at various early sites provide additional evidence for the emergence of a distinct Assyrian identity. While the earlier seals clearly derive from southern Mesopotamian prototypes, featuring the typical scenes of divine intercession and mythological combat favoured by Sumerian engravers, later examples show marked variations in both iconography and style. Assyrian seal cutters began incorporating local religious symbols and developing their own artistic conventions, creating a visual language that would eventually spread throughout their expanding sphere of influence. The development of writing systems in early Assyrian settlements followed similar patterns of adaptation and innovation. The cuneiform script, originally developed by the Sumerians for writing their agglutinative language, required significant modifications to accommodate the grammatical structures of Semitic languages like Akkadian and its northern dialects. Early Assyrian scribes faced the challenge of adapting a writing system designed for one linguistic family to express the complexities of their own Semitic tongue. The earliest written documents from Ashur, dating to approximately 2000 BC, demonstrate the sophisticated level of literacy that had developed among the city's administrative and merchant classes. These texts, primarily commercial records and legal documents, reveal a society that had moved well beyond simple bartering to embrace complex systems of credit, interest, and long-distance partnerships. The language of these documents shows clear dialectal differences from contemporary southern Mesopotamian Akkadian, indicating that the Assyrians were developing their own distinctive linguistic identity alongside their emerging cultural autonomy. Religious practices in early Assyrian society centered around the worship of the god Ashur, whose cult would eventually become the defining characteristic of Assyrian civilization. The deity Ashur appears to have originated as a local manifestation of divine authority, possibly developing from earlier Semitic storm gods or sky deities. Unlike the anthropomorphic gods of the Sumerian pantheon, Ashur was conceived primarily as an abstract divine principle embodying the collective identity and destiny of his people. The earliest temple dedicated to Ashur was constructed on the highest point of the city's limestone outcrop, a location that emphasized both the god's supremacy over the urban landscape and his role as guardian of the community. Archaeological evidence suggests that this original temple was a relatively modest structure, built according to the traditional Mesopotamian temple plan, with a central cellar surrounded by ancillary chambers for ritual activities and storage of sacred objects. The temple complex underwent numerous renovations and expansions throughout the early period, each building phase reflecting the growing prosperity and religious sophistication of the Assyrian community. Excavations have revealed foundation deposits containing votive objects, cylinder seals, and inscribed bricks that provide valuable insights into early Assyrian religious practices. These deposits indicate that the worship of Ashur incorporated elements borrowed from various Mesopotamian traditions while developing its own distinctive characteristics. The god Ashur's role in shaping Assyrian identity extended far beyond purely religious functions. Unlike other Mesopotamian city-states where political authority derived from divine kingship models inherited from Sumerian tradition, early Assyrian society developed a unique system in which the god Ashur himself was considered the true ruler of the city and its territories. Human leaders served merely as the deity's earthly representatives, a concept that would profoundly influence later Assyrian imperial ideology. This theological innovation had practical implications for early Assyrian governance and law. Legal documents from the period consistently invoke Ashur's authority as the ultimate source of justice and social order. Contracts, property deeds, and court records all conclude with formulas calling upon the god to punish those who violate their terms. This integration of religious and legal authority created a cohesive social framework that helped bind the diverse elements of Assyrian society into a unified whole. The interactions between early Assyrian communities and their neighbours played a crucial role in shaping the emerging civilization's cultural characteristics. To the south, the established Akkadian kingdoms provided models of Semitic political organisation and administrative practice that the Assyrians adapted to their own circumstances. Akkadian influence is particularly evident in early Assyrian legal traditions, which borrowed heavily from the sophisticated jurisprudence developed in cities like Babylon and Sippar. Contact with Sumerian city-states, though less direct due to geographical distance, nonetheless left lasting marks on Assyrian civilization. Sumerian religious concepts, architectural techniques, and artistic motifs all found their way into early Assyrian culture through trade contacts and scholarly exchange. The adoption of cuneiform writing itself represents perhaps the most significant Sumerian contribution to Assyrian development, providing the technological foundation for the complex administrative systems that would later enable Assyrian imperial expansion. The Hurrian peoples, who occupied much of the territory between Assyria and Anatolia, maintained particularly close relationships with the early Assyrian city-states. Hurrian influence appears most clearly in religious practices, where numerous Hurrian deities were incorporated into the expanding Assyrian pantheon. The goddess Ishtar, who would later become one of the most important deities in Assyrian religion, entered the local pantheon through Hurrian intermediaries who had themselves adapted this figure from earlier Mesopotamian traditions. Hurrian contributions to early Assyrian culture extended beyond religion to encompass technological innovations, particularly in metallurgy and horse breeding. The Hurrians were among the first peoples to master the techniques of bronze working and horse domestication, skills that proved invaluable to their Assyrian neighbours. Archaeological evidence from early Assyrian sites includes bronze objects that clearly show Hurrian stylistic influences, while textual sources document the importation of horses from Hurrian territories for use in both transportation and emerging military applications. The linguistic landscape of early Assyria reflects this complex pattern of cultural interaction and adaptation. While Assyrian remained fundamentally a Semitic language closely related to Akkadian, it incorporated numerous loanwords from Sumerian, Hurrian, and other neighbouring languages. Technical terminology related to crafts, trade, and administration shows particularly heavy borrowing, indicating the practical nature of much early cultural exchange. Administrative practices in early Assyrian city-states drew selectively from the governmental traditions of their more established neighbours, while developing innovations suited to their particular circumstances. The institution of the Limu, an annually appointed official whose name was used to date documents and events, appears to have been an Assyrian innovation that provided both administrative continuity and a reliable system for chronological record-keeping. This system would eventually become one of the most distinctive features of Assyrian governmental organisation. The early Assyrian military organisation also began to take shape during this formative period, though it remained relatively simple compared to the sophisticated war machine that would later terrorise the ancient world. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Assyrian warriors were equipped primarily with bronze-tipped spears, composite bows, and rectangular shields. The famous Assyrian siege techniques and cavalry tactics would not develop until much later, but the foundations of military organisation were already being established through these city-states' need to protect their valuable trade routes from raiders and rival communities. The transition from early settlement to commercial powerhouse marked a fundamental transformation in Assyrian society around 2000 BC. While the foundations laid during the previous centuries had established Ashur as a regional trading centre, the Old Assyrian period witnessed an unprecedented expansion of commercial activities that would carry Assyrian influence far beyond the Tigris Valley. The merchants of Ashur, building upon their ancestors' experience with local trade networks, began to establish permanent colonies in distant lands, creating what historians now recognise as one of antiquity's most sophisticated commercial empires. The establishment of these merchant colonies, known in Akkadian as Karum, represented a revolutionary approach to long-distance trade. Rather than relying solely on seasonal caravans or temporary trading posts, Assyrian merchants created permanent settlements that functioned as self-governing commercial centres within foreign territories. These colonies maintained their own legal systems, religious practices, and administrative structures while operating under agreements negotiated with local rulers. The Karum system allowed Assyrian traders to maintain year-round operations in distant markets, accumulating detailed knowledge of local conditions and building lasting relationships with suppliers and customers. The most significant of these colonies was established at Kultepe, the ancient city of Kanesh, located in central Anatolia, approximately 800 kilometers northwest of Ashur. The site occupied a strategic position along the trade routes connecting the Anatolian plateau with the Syrian plains, making it an ideal location for merchants seeking to tap into the region's abundant mineral resources. The Assyrian quarter at Kultepe, known as the Karum Kanesh, grew into a thriving community that housed hundreds of Assyrian families alongside their Anatolian neighbours and business partners. Archaeological excavations at Kultepe have revealed the remarkable extent of Assyrian commercial operations in Anatolia. The merchant quarter covered approximately 70 hectares and contained dozens of substantial houses built in the traditional Mesopotamian style, with central courtyards surrounded by living quarters, storage rooms, and business offices. These residences served multiple functions, combining family dwellings with commercial facilities where merchants conducted their daily business operations. Many houses contained private archives where thousands of cuneiform tablets documented every aspect of commercial activity. The physical layout of the Karum reflected the sophisticated organisation of Assyrian commercial society. Larger houses belonged to established merchant families who had accumulated substantial wealth through successful trading ventures, while smaller residences housed younger merchants, clerks, and craftsmen who supported the colony's operations. The quarter included specialised workshops where local artisans produced goods according to Assyrian specifications, as well as warehouses where imported merchandise was stored before distribution throughout Anatolia. The Assyrian trading network centred on two primary commodities that generated enormous profits for the merchant families of Ashur. Textiles manufactured in Mesopotamian workshops formed the backbone of Assyrian exports to Anatolia, where local populations prized the fine fabrics produced by skilled weavers in cities like Ashur, Babylon, and Mari. These textiles included elaborately decorated garments, ceremonial robes, and practical everyday clothing that commanded high prices in Anatolian markets. Assyrian merchants also dealt extensively in tin, a crucial component in bronze production that was extracted from mines in the eastern regions of the Assyrian homeland and transported westward in carefully guarded caravans. The return trade from Anatolia focused primarily on precious metals, particularly silver and gold, which were abundant in the mountainous regions of central and eastern Anatolia. Local rulers and wealthy individuals exchanged these metals for Assyrian textiles and tin, creating a profitable cycle that enriched both parties. The Assyrians also imported copper, lead, and iron ore from Anatolian sources, materials that were processed in Mesopotamian workshops to produce tools, weapons, and decorative objects. The Kultepe archives, discovered during excavations conducted throughout the 20th century, constitute one of the most important collections of ancient commercial documents ever recovered. More than 23,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments have been catalogued, providing unprecedented insights into the daily operations of ancient international trade. These documents span approximately 2 centuries of commercial activity and include contracts, correspondence, legal proceedings, and personal letters that illuminate every aspect of Assyrian merchant society. The commercial law revealed in these tablets demonstrates the sophisticated legal framework that governed Assyrian trading operations. Contracts specified precise terms for the delivery of goods, payment schedules, and penalties for breach of agreement. Partnership arrangements detailed the responsibilities of each party in joint ventures, including the division of profits and losses. Credit agreements established interest rates, collateral requirements, and procedures for debt collection. These legal instruments provided the stability and predictability necessary for long-distance commerce to flourish. The tablets also reveal complex family structures that supported commercial operations across vast distances. Merchant families typically maintained members in both Ashur and the Anatolian colonies, creating kinship networks that facilitated business communications and financial transfers. Fathers often established their sons in colonial trading posts while retaining control of operations from the homeland. Brothers frequently formed partnerships that divided responsibilities between different markets or commodity specializations. Marriage alliances between merchant families created broader commercial networks that enhanced trading opportunities and reduced business risks. Women played significant roles in Assyrian commercial society, as evidenced by numerous tablets documenting their business activities. Merchant wives often managed household finances and supervised local trading operations, while their husbands travelled on business. Some women operated independent businesses, particularly in textile production and local retail trade. The archives contained correspondence between husbands and wives discussing business matters, family affairs, and financial decisions, revealing the collaborative nature of merchant family enterprises. The long-distance communication systems documented in the Kultepe archives represent one of the most remarkable achievements of old Assyrian civilization. Regular mail service connected Ashur with its Anatolian colonies, enabling merchants to coordinate their activities across hundreds of kilometers. Professional messengers carried sealed letters between trading centers, following established routes that minimized travel time and security risks. The correspondence reveals that letters typically took between 2 and 4 weeks to travel from Ashur to Kultepe, depending on weather conditions and political circumstances. These letters provide intimate glimpses into the personal lives of Assyrian merchants and their families. Husbands wrote to their wives about business prospects and family matters, while wives responded with news about children, household affairs, and local developments. Parents corresponded with their children studying or working in distant cities, offering advice and maintaining family connections across great distances. The emotional content of these letters reveals the human costs of commercial success, as family members endured long separations in pursuit of trading opportunities. The rise of powerful Assyrian rulers during this period transformed the political landscape of northern Mesopotamia and established the foundations for later imperial expansion. The most significant of these early kings was Shamshi-Adad I, who ruled from approximately 1813 to 1781 BC and created the first Assyrian territorial state that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the city of Ashur. His reign marked the transition from merchant-dominated city-state to militaristic kingdom, establishing patterns of governance and expansion that would characterize Assyrian civilization for centuries to come. Shamshi-Adad. I was not originally from Ashur, but rather came from the Amorite populations that had been migrating into Mesopotamia during the preceding centuries. These Semitic-speaking peoples brought new military techniques and political concepts that revitalized the established urban centers of the region. After gaining control of Ashur, Shamshi-Adad embarked on an ambitious campaign of territorial expansion that ultimately created an empire stretching from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Mediterranean coast in the west. The military campaigns of Shamshi-Adad I demonstrated new approaches to warfare that would become characteristic of later Assyrian military doctrine. Rather than relying primarily on citizen militias or temporary levies, he created professional military units that could campaign continuously throughout the year. These forces included specialized infantry formations equipped with standardized weapons and armor, as well as mobile units that could respond rapidly to threats or opportunities across his expanding territories. His administrative innovations proved equally significant for the development of Assyrian governmental practices. Shamshi-Adad established a system of provincial governors who reported directly to the king and were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and implementing royal policies in their assigned territories. These officials, often drawn from the Assyrian nobility or trusted military commanders, served as the king's representatives in distant regions where direct royal control would have been impractical. The diplomatic correspondence from Shamshi-Adad's reign, preserved in archives at Mari and other contemporary sites, reveals the sophisticated international relations that characterized the early 2nd millennium BC. The Assyrian king maintained regular communication with his counterparts in Babylon, Mari, Eshnunna, and other major powers, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and coordinating military campaigns. These letters demonstrate his skill in balancing competing interests while advancing Assyrian territorial and commercial objectives. One of the most revealing aspects of Shamshi-Adad's reign was his relationship with his sons, whom he installed as rulers of conquered territories. His correspondence with these princes provides insights into both his administrative methods and his personal character. The letters reveal a demanding father who expected his sons to demonstrate competence in military leadership, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic finesse. His frequent criticisms of their performance illuminate the challenges of governing a far-flung empire with primitive communications technology. The kingdom established by Shamshi-Adad I represented a fundamental departure from traditional Mesopotamian political organization. Unlike the city-states that had dominated the region for millennia, his realm was conceived as a unified territorial entity under centralized royal authority. This innovation required new administrative techniques, military organization, and ideological justifications that would influence Mesopotamian political development for centuries to come. The administrative practices developed during this period established precedents that would characterize Assyrian governance throughout its subsequent history. Royal inscriptions from Shamshi-Adad's reign emphasized the king's role as the earthly representative of the god Ashur, responsible for extending divine authority over ever wider territories. This theological framework provided justification for military expansion, while creating ideological unity among diverse populations incorporated into the growing kingdom. The military organization created by Shamshi-Adad and his successors represented a significant evolution from earlier Mesopotamian warfare practices. Professional soldiers replaced citizen militias as the core of military strength, enabling sustained campaigns that were impossible with part-time forces. Standardized equipment and training created more effective fighting units, while improved logistics systems allowed armies to operate at greater distances from their home bases. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals the complex network of alliances and rivalries that shaped international relations in the ancient Near East. Assyrian kings negotiated with their counterparts as equals, exchanging gifts, arranging marriages, and coordinating military campaigns against common enemies. These relationships required sophisticated diplomatic protocols and communication systems that facilitated regular contact between distant courts. The legacy of the Old Assyrian period extended far beyond its immediate chronological boundaries, establishing institutional frameworks and cultural patterns that would define Assyrian civilization for more than a millennium. The commercial networks created by Assyrian merchants provided economic foundations for later imperial expansion, while the administrative innovations of early kings established governmental practices that would enable the management of vast territorial empires. The synthesis of commercial expertise and military power that characterized this period created the distinctive Assyrian approach to international relations that would eventually dominate the ancient Near East. The collapse of Shamshi-Adad's empire around 1750 BC plunged Assyria into a prolonged period of political fragmentation and foreign domination that would test the resilience of Assyrian civilization for nearly 2 centuries. The once mighty kingdom fragmented into competing city-states and tribal territories, while powerful neighbours seized the opportunity to expand their influence over the weakened Assyrian heartland. The Babylonians under Hammurabi had already begun encroaching on southern Assyrian territories during Shamshi-Adad's lifetime, and his death removed the primary obstacle to their northern expansion. The most significant challenge to Assyrian independence came from the emerging Mitannian kingdom, a Hurrian-dominated state that consolidated power across northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia during the 16th and 15th centuries BC. The Mitannians represented a formidable military force, having mastered the use of horse-drawn chariots and developed sophisticated siege techniques that gave them decisive advantages over traditional infantry-based armies. Their expansion southward from the Anatolian highlands brought them into direct conflict with the remnants of Assyrian political authority, ultimately reducing Ashur and its satellite cities to vassal status. The period of Mitannian overlordship fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Mesopotamia. Unlike previous conquerors who had simply extracted tribute and withdrawn, the Mitannians established a systematic administrative presence in Assyrian territories. Mitannian governors took up residence in major Assyrian cities, supervising local rulers and ensuring compliance with imperial policies. These officials brought with them Hurrian administrative practices, religious concepts, and artistic traditions that left lasting influences on Assyrian culture. Despite their subordinate status, Assyrian rulers during this period demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in preserving their autonomy under foreign overlordship. Rather than attempting futile resistance against superior military forces, they adopted strategies of accommodation and gradual strengthening that would eventually enable their resurgence. Local rulers maintained the traditional institutions of Assyrian governance while carefully avoiding actions that might provoke Mitannian intervention. They continued to appoint Limut officials, conduct religious ceremonies in honor of Ashur, and administer justice according to Assyrian legal traditions. The most successful of these survival strategies involved the cultivation of personal relationships with Mitannian officials in the royal court at Washukani. Assyrian princes and nobles frequently travelled to the Mitannian capital, where they served in ceremonial positions and participated in court rituals. These experiences provided valuable insights into Mitannian military organisation, administrative practices, and diplomatic protocols that would prove useful when circumstances eventually permitted Assyrian independence. Some Assyrian nobles married into Hurrian families, creating kinship networks that facilitated political communication and commercial cooperation. Economic adaptation proved equally crucial to Assyrian survival during the period of foreign domination. The traditional long-distance trading networks that had generated wealth during the Old Assyrian period continued to operate, though under Mitannian supervision and taxation. Assyrian merchants maintained their commercial relationships with Anatolian partners, while developing new trading connections with Hurrian settlements throughout the Mitannian sphere of influence. These economic activities provided the financial resources necessary to maintain Assyrian political institutions and military capabilities during the long period of vassalage. The gradual weakening of Mitannian power during the 14th century BC created opportunities for Assyrian resurgence that skillful rulers were quick to exploit. Internal succession disputes within the Mitannian royal family, combined with increasing pressure from Egyptian and Hittite expansion, diverted attention from the supervision of Assyrian vassals. Local Assyrian rulers began testing the limits of their autonomy, expanding their territorial control and strengthening their military forces while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with their Mitannian overlords. The reign of Ashur-Uballit I, who ruled from approximately 1365 to 1330 BC, marked the definitive beginning of Assyrian imperial resurgence and the transformation of a minor vassal state into a major regional power. His accession to the throne coincided with a period of Mitannian weakness that allowed him to assert increasingly independent policies without triggering immediate retaliation. Archaeological evidence from his reign reveals extensive construction projects in Ashur, including the renovation of temples and the strengthening of city fortifications that demonstrated growing confidence in Assyrian capabilities. The military reforms implemented by Ashur-Uballit I laid the foundation for all subsequent Assyrian military success. Drawing upon lessons learned during the period of Mitannian domination, he reorganized the Assyrian army according to new tactical principles that emphasized mobility, coordination, and technological innovation. The traditional infantry formations were supplemented with chariot units, modelled on Mitannian prototypes but adapted to Assyrian strategic requirements. These vehicles, constructed with lighter frames and equipped with composite bows, provided rapid striking power that could exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. More significantly, Ashur-Uballit began the systematic development of siege warfare techniques that would become the hallmark of Assyrian military doctrine. Previous Mesopotamian armies had generally avoided prolonged sieges, preferring to defeat enemies in open battle or force their submission through economic blockade. The Assyrians, however, developed specialized equipment and tactics for reducing fortified positions, including portable siege towers, battering rams, and undermining techniques that could breach the strongest defensive walls. The adoption of iron weapons during Ashur-Uballit's reign provided Assyrian forces with technological advantages that proved decisive in their conflicts with bronze-equipped enemies. Iron ore was readily available in the mountainous regions east of Assyria, and local metalworkers had developed the sophisticated smelting and forging techniques necessary to produce high-quality weapons and tools. Iron swords and spearheads were harder and more durable than bronze equivalents, while iron-tipped arrows could penetrate armour that deflected bronze projectiles. The territorial expansion that began under Ashurbanipal and followed carefully planned strategies that maximised Assyrian advantages while minimising the risks of overextension. Rather than attempting to conquer vast territories through rapid campaigns, Assyrian forces focused on securing strategic positions that controlled important trade routes and communication networks. River crossings, mountain passes, and fortified cities received priority attention, as their capture could effectively isolate enemy territories and disrupt their ability to coordinate resistance. The first major test of these new military capabilities came through conflicts with Babylonia, whose rulers had maintained nominal suzerainty over southern Assyrian territories since the time of Hammurabi. The Babylonian king Brilliance II initially attempted to reassert his authority over Assyria through diplomatic pressure, demanding that Ashurbanipal acknowledge Babylonian overlordship and cease his independent foreign policy initiatives. When these demands were rejected, military confrontation became inevitable. The Assyrian victory over Babylonian forces near the city of Sugagu in approximately 1350 BC demonstrated the effectiveness of the new military organisation and marked Assyria's emergence as an independent regional power. Assyrian infantry, supported by chariot units and equipped with iron weapons, routed a larger Babylonian army that relied on traditional bronze equipment and outdated tactical formations. The battle's outcome sent shockwaves throughout the region, as established powers recognized that a new military force had emerged in northern Mesopotamia. Following this initial success, Ashurbanipal expanded Assyrian control southward along the Tigris Valley, capturing cities that had been under Babylonian influence for centuries. These conquests were consolidated through the establishment of Assyrian garrisons and the appointment of loyal governors who implemented standardized administrative practices throughout the expanding kingdom. The integration of conquered territories required sophisticated organizational capabilities that built upon the administrative traditions developed during the Old Assyrian period. The reign of Adad-nirari I, who ruled from approximately 1307 to 1275 BC, witnessed the continuation and intensification of Assyrian military expansion under a ruler who combined strategic vision with tactical brilliance. His accession occurred during a period of continued Mitannian decline, as the once powerful kingdom faced increasing pressure from Hittite expansion in the west and internal rebellions throughout its territories. These circumstances provided ideal conditions for Assyrian territorial expansion, as traditional enemies were distracted by more immediate threats. The military campaigns conducted by Adad-nirari I demonstrated the maturation of Assyrian siege warfare techniques and the development of combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment into coordinated operations. His forces successfully reduced numerous fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable, including several major Mitannian strongholds in the Kabur River Valley. These victories were achieved through innovative siege techniques that combined traditional methods with new technologies adapted from captured equipment and interrogated prisoners. The systematic destruction of Mitannian power in northern Mesopotamia removed the primary obstacle to Assyrian expansion and established Assyria as the dominant force in the region. Adad-nirari's armies advanced westward across the Euphrates, capturing strategic cities and establishing Assyrian control over territories that had been Mitannian vassals for centuries. These conquests brought enormous wealth into the Assyrian treasury through plunder, tribute, and the control of lucrative trade routes that connected Anatolia with the Levantine coast. The administrative system developed during Adad-nirari's reign established precedents that would govern Assyrian imperial administration for centuries to come. Conquered territories were organized into provinces under appointed governors who reported directly to the king and were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and implementing royal policies. These officials, typically drawn from the Assyrian nobility or proven military commanders, received extensive training in administrative procedures and were subject to regular inspections that ensured their compliance with imperial standards. The treatment of conquered populations reflected sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in governing diverse ethnic and cultural groups within a unified imperial framework. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Assyrian practices throughout their territories, imperial administrators adopted flexible policies that preserved local customs and institutions while ensuring political loyalty and economic productivity. Local rulers who submitted voluntarily were often permitted to retain their positions under Assyrian supervision, while those who resisted faced deportation or execution. Shalmaneser I, who ruled from approximately 1274 to 1245 BC, inherited an expanding kingdom and continued the aggressive military policies that had characterized his predecessors' reigns. His campaigns extended Assyrian control further westward into Syria and southward into Babylonian territories, while also securing the kingdom's eastern frontiers against threats from the Zagros Mountains. The military machine that he commanded had evolved into one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world, combining technological superiority with tactical innovation and strategic planning. The siege of Carchemish during Shalmaneser's reign demonstrated the advanced state of Assyrian military engineering and the systematic approach that characterized their reduction of fortified positions. The city, located on the Euphrates at a crucial crossing point between Anatolia and Syria, had been fortified with massive walls and towers that seemed to defy conventional assault. Assyrian engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included movable towers taller than the city's walls, battering rams protected by armoured housings, and tunnelling operations that undermined key defensive positions. The successful capture of Carchemish after a prolonged siege established Assyrian control over one of the most important strategic positions in northern Syria and demonstrated to potential enemies the futility of relying solely on passive defensive measures. The city's fall was followed by the systematic destruction of its fortifications and the deportation of significant portions of its population to other parts of the Assyrian Empire, a practice that would become standard procedure in later imperial expansion. The reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, from approximately 1244 to 1208 BC, represented the pinnacle of Middle Assyrian military achievement and territorial expansion. His campaigns extended Assyrian power to its greatest extent during this period, reaching from the Iranian plateau in the east to the Mediterranean coast in the west, and from the Anatolian highlands in the north to central Babylonia in the south. The empire he created rivaled in size and power the greatest states of the ancient Near East, and established Assyria as a major player in international politics. The most spectacular achievement of Tukulti-Ninurta's reign was his conquest of Babylon itself, an unprecedented feat that shocked the ancient world and demonstrated the complete transformation of Assyrian military capabilities. The capture of the most prestigious city in Mesopotamia required not only military skill, but also sophisticated logistical planning and diplomatic preparation. Assyrian forces had to maintain supply lines across hundreds of kilometers while conducting complex siege operations against one of the world's most heavily fortified cities. The administrative challenges posed by governing such vast territories required further innovations in imperial organization and communication systems. Tukulti-Ninurta established a network of royal roads that connected major cities and facilitated rapid communication between the capital and distant provinces. Professional messengers carried official correspondence along these routes, while relay stations provided fresh horses and supplies for urgent dispatches. This communication network enabled centralized control over territories that would have been ungovernable with primitive transportation technology. The development of standardized administrative procedures throughout the empire reflected the sophisticated bureaucratic capabilities that devolved from the commercial expertise of the Old Assyrian period. Provincial governors received detailed instructions regarding taxation, legal administration, military recruitment, and public works projects. Regular reports documented local conditions and imperial compliance, while inspection tours by royal officials ensured that provincial administration met imperial standards. The ironworking technology that had provided initial military advantages continued to evolve throughout the Middle Assyrian period, with improvements in smelting techniques and weapon design that maintained Assyrian technological superiority over their enemies. Specialized workshops in major cities produced standardized weapons and armor for military units, while captured metal workers were relocated to Assyrian territories where they could contribute their skills to imperial production. The systematic exploitation of iron ore deposits in the Zagros Mountains provided the raw materials necessary to equip the expanding armies that secured Assyrian territorial gains. The death of Tukulti-Ninurta, versed around 1208 BC, marked the beginning of one of the most challenging periods in Assyrian history, as the mighty empire he had forged began to fragment under the combined pressures of internal succession disputes and external invasions. The late Bronze Age collapse that devastated civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean during the 12th and 11th centuries BC struck Assyria with particular severity, threatening to undo centuries of territorial expansion and institutional development. The mysterious sea peoples, whose origins remain debated among scholars, disrupted trade networks and political stability throughout the region, while massive population movements displaced established communities and created new centers of power that challenged traditional political arrangements. The most immediate threat to Assyrian survival came from the Aramean migrations that swept across northern Mesopotamia during this period of upheaval. These Semitic-speaking nomadic peoples, driven from their traditional grazing lands by climate change and population pressure, moved in vast tribal confederations that overwhelmed the defensive capabilities of settled communities. Unlike previous nomadic incursions that had been limited in scope and duration, the Aramean migrations represented a fundamental demographic shift that permanently altered the ethnic composition of Syria and northern Mesopotamia. Tiglath-Pileser I, who ascended to the Assyrian throne around 1115 BC, confronted challenges that would have destroyed a less resilient civilization. The kingdom he inherited bore little resemblance to the mighty empire of his predecessors, having been reduced to a core territory around Ashur and a handful of loyal cities along the middle Tigris. Aramean tribes had established themselves throughout former Assyrian territories, while Babylonian forces had reclaimed much of southern Mesopotamia. The traditional trade routes that had provided economic foundations for Assyrian power lay disrupted by constant warfare and political instability. The military situation facing Tiglath-Pileser required immediate attention, as Aramean raiders penetrated deep into the Assyrian heartland with increasing frequency and boldness. These tribal warriors employed hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain, avoiding direct confrontation with Assyrian forces, while systematically destroying agricultural settlements and disrupting economic activities. Traditional Assyrian military doctrine, designed for territorial conquest and siege warfare, proved inadequate against enemies who refused to defend fixed positions or engage in conventional battles. Tiglath-Pileser's response to these challenges demonstrated remarkable adaptability and strategic insight. Rather than attempting to restore the full territorial extent of the Middle Assyrian Empire, he focused on securing the core regions necessary for long-term survival while developing new military techniques suited to the changed strategic environment. His forces adopted lighter equipment and more flexible formations that could match Aramean mobility, while maintaining the disciplined coordination that had traditionally distinguished Assyrian armies from their enemies. The king's military reforms included the systematic recruitment of auxiliary forces from allied tribes and conquered populations, creating composite armies that combined Assyrian organizational skills with diverse tactical capabilities. Aramean horsemen provided scouting and pursuit capabilities that traditional Assyrian forces lacked, while mountain peoples contributed specialized knowledge of guerrilla warfare techniques. These innovations required modifications to existing command structures and communication systems, as diverse ethnic groups needed coordination without losing their distinctive tactical advantages. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Assyrian heartland reveals the extensive fortification programs undertaken during Tiglath-Pileser's reign. Existing cities received strengthened walls and improved defensive works, while new fortified positions were established at strategic locations along major invasion routes. These defensive installations incorporated lessons learned from recent Aramean attacks, featuring multiple defensive lines, protected water supplies, and storage facilities that could sustain prolonged sieges. The construction techniques employed in these fortifications reflected technological innovations that would characterize later Assyrian military engineering. Walls were built with carefully fitted stone foundations supporting mud brick superstructures, creating defensive barriers that could withstand both siege engines and natural weathering. Defensive towers incorporated multiple levels for archers and siege equipment operators, while gates were protected by complex approach systems that channeled attackers into killing zones where defenders held decisive advantages. Tiglath-Pileser's campaigns against the Aramean tribes established precedents for dealing with nomadic enemies that would influence Assyrian military doctrine for centuries. Rather than attempting to occupy tribal territories permanently, Assyrian forces focused on disrupting tribal unity and destroying their economic foundations. Livestock herds were captured or scattered, water sources were poisoned or fortified, and tribal leaders were either eliminated or forced into submission through systematic pressure on their followers. The integration of iron weapons technology accelerated dramatically during this period of military innovation. Assyrian metalworkers, building upon techniques developed during the Middle Assyrian period, achieved new levels of sophistication in iron production and weapon manufacturing. Specialized workshops produced standardized spear points, sword blades, and arrowheads that provided Assyrian forces with decisive advantages over enemies still relying primarily on bronze equipment. The development of cavalry units during Tiglath-Pileser's reign represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Mesopotamian military organization. Previous armies had employed horses primarily for pulling chariots, but the new tactical environment required more flexible, mounted forces capable of independent operations. Assyrian cavalry initially consisted of light horsemen equipped with composite bows and javelins, designed for reconnaissance and harassment rather than direct combat. These units proved invaluable for countering Aramean mobility advantages and extending Assyrian operational reach across difficult terrain. The administrative challenges posed by governing during this period of instability required significant modifications to existing governmental structures. Provincial administration had to accommodate the reality of contested territories and unreliable communications, while maintaining enough central control to coordinate military operations and resource allocation. Tiglath-Pileser developed a system of military governors who combined civilian administrative responsibilities with command authority over local garrison forces. The economic policies implemented during this period reflected the need to rebuild Assyrian prosperity while adapting to changed commercial conditions. Traditional long-distance trade networks had been severely disrupted by political instability and population movements, forcing Assyrian merchants to develop new trading relationships and transportation routes. The kingdom's commercial focus shifted toward regional markets that could be accessed and protected by military force, while maintaining limited connections with more distant trading partners through diplomatic arrangements. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser established the foundations for eventual Assyrian recovery, but his death around 1077 BC initiated what historians term the Assyrian Dark Age, a period of approximately 2 centuries during which the kingdom struggled to maintain even its reduced territorial holdings. The succession disputes that followed his death weakened central authority and encouraged rebellions throughout the remaining Assyrian territories. Aramean pressure intensified as tribal confederations recognized Assyrian weakness and launched coordinated attacks on major cities. The limited written sources from this period document a kingdom in severe decline, with royal inscriptions becoming increasingly rare and administrative records reflecting drastically reduced governmental capabilities. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian cities shows clear signs of economic contraction, with construction projects halted, population levels declining, and material culture becoming increasingly impoverished. The great temples of Ashur received minimal maintenance, while the royal palace complex fell into partial ruin. Despite these challenges, Assyrian civilization demonstrated remarkable resilience during its darkest period. Local communities maintained traditional institutions and cultural practices, even when central authority collapsed, preserving the knowledge and skills that would enable eventual recovery. Scribal schools continued to operate in major cities, maintaining literacy and preserving the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. Religious observances honouring Ashur and other traditional deities provided cultural continuity that sustained Assyrian identity through political fragmentation. The gradual recovery that began during the 10th century BC reflected the cumulative effect of incremental improvements rather than dramatic military victories. Local rulers slowly expanded their control over surrounding territories, rebuilding the economic foundations necessary for sustained political authority. Agricultural productivity recovered as security conditions improved, while limited trade relationships were re-established with neighbouring regions. The military innovations developed during the crisis period proved crucial to this gradual recovery. Iron weapons technology had become sufficiently advanced to provide clear advantages over bronze-equipped enemies, while new tactical formations incorporated lessons learned from decades of warfare against mobile opponents. The integration of cavalry units into standard military organisation gave Assyrian forces capabilities that traditional enemies could not match. Adad-nirari II, who ruled from approximately 912 to 891 BC, inherited a kingdom that had survived its darkest period and was positioned for renewed expansion. His reign marked the definitive beginning of what historians term the Neo-Assyrian period, characterized by systematic territorial conquest, administrative innovation, and cultural achievements that would establish Assyria as the dominant power in the ancient Near East. The military machine he commanded had evolved significantly from its Middle Assyrian predecessors, incorporating technological advances and tactical innovations developed during the preceding centuries of warfare. The army that Adad-nirari II led into battle represented the culmination of military evolution that had begun during Tiglath-Pileser III's desperate struggle for survival. Iron weapons had achieved complete standardization throughout Assyrian forces, with specialized workshops producing uniform equipment that maintained consistent quality across all military units. Spear points, sword blades, and arrowheads manufactured in royal armouries displayed sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produced weapons superior to anything available to potential enemies. The systematic use of cavalry had transformed Assyrian tactical capabilities, providing commanders with reconnaissance, pursuit, and harassment options that previous generations had lacked. These mounted units had evolved beyond their original light cavalry role to include heavily armoured horsemen capable of charging enemy formations and engaging in direct combat. The integration of cavalry with traditional infantry and siege units created combined arms capabilities that could adapt to diverse tactical situations. Siege warfare techniques had achieved new levels of sophistication through continuous refinement during the preceding centuries of conflict. Assyrian engineers had developed portable siege towers that could be rapidly assembled at attack sites, battering rams with improved protective housings and undermining techniques that could breach the strongest defensive walls. The systematic approach to reducing fortified positions reflected accumulated experience from hundreds of siege operations conducted throughout the region. The deportation policy that would become synonymous with Assyrian imperial administration had its origins in the practical necessities of governing conquered territories during this period of expansion. Rather than simply extracting tribute from defeated enemies, Assyrian administrators began relocating skilled populations to regions where their capabilities could contribute to imperial strength. Craftsmen, farmers, and administrative personnel were transferred from conquered territories to underpopulated regions of the Assyrian heartland, where they provided labour and expertise for reconstruction projects. This population transfer policy served multiple strategic objectives beyond simple economic exploitation. The removal of local elites and skilled workers from conquered territories reduced the likelihood of successful rebellions by eliminating the leadership and technical capabilities necessary for organised resistance. Simultaneously, the integration of diverse populations into the Assyrian heartland strengthened the kingdom's human resources while creating cultural mixing that gradually expanded Assyrian identity beyond its original ethnic boundaries. The administrative framework developed to manage these population transfers required sophisticated organizational capabilities that built upon centuries of Assyrian governmental experience. Detailed records documented the skills, origins, and destinations of relocated populations, while specialized officials supervised their integration into new communities. Housing, employment, and social services were provided to ensure that deportees became productive contributors to imperial prosperity, rather than sources of internal instability. The military campaigns conducted by Adad-nirari II established patterns of systematic conquest that would characterize Neo-Assyrian expansion for the next 3 centuries. Rather than seeking rapid territorial gains through dramatic victories, Assyrian forces focused on methodical reduction of enemy strongholds and the establishment of permanent control over strategic regions. Each campaign built upon previous successes, creating expanding zones of Assyrian authority that could support further military operations. The accession of Ashur-Nasirpal II to the Assyrian throne in 883 BC marked the beginning of an era that would witness the transformation of Assyria from a regional power into the undisputed master of Mesopotamia and beyond. The king who inherited the throne possessed not only the military machine forged by his predecessors, but also an unprecedented understanding of how to combine brute force with sophisticated administrative control to create lasting imperial dominance. His reign would establish the template for Neo-Assyrian imperial expansion, combining systematic military conquest with psychological warfare, administrative genius, and architectural propaganda that proclaimed Assyrian supremacy to both subjects and enemies. The military campaigns that defined Ashur-Nasirpal's reign began almost immediately after his coronation, targeting the mountainous regions east of Assyria, where numerous small kingdoms and tribal confederations had maintained their independence during the preceding centuries of Assyrian weakness. These initial expeditions served multiple purposes beyond simple territorial expansion, providing opportunities to test the effectiveness of military reforms while demonstrating to potential enemies throughout the region that the new king possessed both the capability and determination to enforce Assyrian authority wherever it was challenged. The siege of Suru, a fortified city in the Zagros foothills that had refused to acknowledge Assyrian suzerainty, demonstrated the lethal efficiency of the military machine that Ashur-Nasirpal commanded. Assyrian forces surrounded the city with a systematic precision that reflected decades of experience in siege warfare, establishing multiple camps that controlled all approaches, while engineers began constructing the specialized equipment necessary for reducing the fortifications. Massive siege towers, built from timber harvested in the surrounding forests, rose higher than the city's defensive walls, providing platforms for archers and siege engines that could rain destruction down upon the defenders. The battering rams employed during the siege incorporated technological innovations that made them far more effective than their predecessors. These massive bronze-headed devices were mounted on wheeled platforms protected by leather and metal housings that deflected arrows and stones hurled by desperate defenders. Teams of soldiers operated these weapons in coordinated shifts, maintaining continuous pressure against selected points on the defensive walls, while other units prepared to exploit any breach that might develop. The systematic nature of these operations reflected the professional training and discipline that distinguished Assyrian forces from the irregular militias that defended most fortified positions. When the walls of Suru finally collapsed after weeks of relentless assault, the treatment of the city's population established precedents for Assyrian conquest policy that would terrorize enemies throughout the region. Rather than simply accepting the submission of the surviving defenders, Ashur-Nirpal ordered the systematic execution of the city's leadership and the deportation of skilled craftsmen and agricultural workers to other parts of the growing empire. The remaining population was subjected to brutal punishments designed to serve as warnings to other communities that might consider resistance to Assyrian authority. The royal inscriptions that documented these events describe in graphic detail the fate of those who dared oppose Assyrian expansion. City officials were flayed alive, their skins displayed on the walls as warnings to future rebels. Military commanders were impaled on stakes erected around the ruined city, while common soldiers faced mass execution or enslavement. These descriptions were not mere royal boasting, but carefully crafted psychological warfare designed to spread terror throughout regions targeted for conquest, encouraging voluntary submission rather than costly military resistance. The administrative genius that accompanied Ashur-Nirpal's military conquests proved equally important to the creation of lasting imperial control. Unlike previous conquerors who had been content to extract tribute and withdraw, the Assyrians developed sophisticated systems for integrating conquered territories into a unified imperial structure that could generate sustained economic and military benefits. Provincial governors appointed from the Assyrian nobility or proven military commanders established administrative centres in major cities, implementing standardised legal codes, taxation systems, and communication networks that connected distant territories to the imperial capital. The construction of Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, represented the most spectacular achievement of Ashur-Nirpal's reign, and demonstrated the unprecedented wealth and organisational capabilities the successful conquest had generated. Located approximately 30 kilometres south of the ancient capital at Ashur, the new city occupied a strategic position along the Tigris River that provided excellent defensive advantages while facilitating communication with all parts of the expanding empire. The decision to establish a new capital rather than simply expanding existing facilities reflected both practical considerations and the king's desire to create a monument that would proclaim Assyrian greatness for all eternity. The scale of construction at Kalhu dwarfed anything previously attempted in Mesopotamian architecture. The city walls, built from massive limestone blocks quarried in the nearby mountains, enclosed an area of approximately 360 hectares and rose to heights that made them visible from great distances across the surrounding plains. These fortifications incorporated the most advanced defensive techniques available, featuring multiple defensive lines, protected gates, and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that could devastate any attacking force. The engineering expertise required for such construction demonstrated the sophisticated technical capabilities that Assyrian civilization had developed through centuries of military and commercial experience. The royal palace complex at Kalhu established new standards for architectural grandeur that reflected both the king's personal taste and the political requirements of imperial rule. The structure covered more than 2.5 hectares and contained hundreds of rooms designed for different aspects of royal administration, ceremonial functions, and private residence. Throne rooms decorated with elaborate wall reliefs provided settings for diplomatic receptions and court ceremonies, while private apartments offered luxurious accommodations for the royal family and their immediate household. Administrative offices housed the growing bureaucracy necessary to manage imperial affairs, while storage facilities contained the wealth flowing into the capital from conquered territories. The artistic program that decorated the palace walls represented a revolutionary development in Mesopotamian art, combining traditional religious themes with unprecedented celebrations of royal military achievement. Stone relief panels carved by skilled artisans depicted scenes from Ashur-Nashirpal's campaigns in minute detail, showing Assyrian forces storming enemy cities, executing captured rebels, and receiving the submission of defeated rulers. These images served multiple purposes beyond simple decoration, providing visual narratives that proclaimed imperial power while offering detailed documentation of military techniques and equipment for the instruction of future generations. The psychological impact of these artistic displays extended far beyond their immediate aesthetic effect. Foreign ambassadors and provincial governors who visited the palace encountered room after room of carved scenes depicting the fate of those who opposed Assyrian authority, creating powerful impressions that influenced their subsequent behavior and policy recommendations. The systematic nature of this artistic propaganda reflected sophisticated understanding of how visual imagery could reinforce political messages and create lasting psychological effects that supported imperial control. The development of standardized artistic conventions during this period established iconographic traditions that would characterize Assyrian royal art for centuries. Kings were consistently depicted as larger than other figures, emphasizing their superior status and divine authority. Military scenes followed established compositional formulas that highlighted Assyrian technological advantages and tactical superiority. Religious imagery incorporated the god Ashur as the ultimate source of royal authority, creating theological justifications for imperial expansion that resonated with both Assyrian and foreign audiences. The administrative systems developed to manage the growing empire required innovations in communication, record-keeping and personnel management that built upon earlier Assyrian governmental traditions while adapting to the unprecedented scale of territorial control. Royal messengers carried official correspondence along established routes that connected the capital with provincial centres throughout the empire, while relay stations provided fresh horses and supplies that enabled rapid communication across vast distances. The standardization of administrative procedures ensured that provincial officials implemented consistent policies regardless of local conditions or cultural differences. The tribute system that emerged during Ashur-Nashirpal's reign provided the economic foundation for continued military expansion while demonstrating Assyrian power to subject populations throughout the empire. Annual tribute payments from conquered territories included precious metals, luxury goods, raw materials, and skilled personnel that enriched the imperial treasury while depriving potential enemies of resources that might support rebellion. The systematic collection and transportation of these payments required sophisticated logistical capabilities that employed thousands of officials, guards, and transport workers throughout the empire. The reign of Shalmaneser III, who succeeded his father Ashur-Nashirpal II in 858 BC, witnessed the continuation and intensification of Assyrian expansion under a ruler whose military campaigns would extend imperial control further than any previous monarch. The kingdom he inherited possessed unprecedented military capabilities, administrative sophistication, and economic resources that enabled sustained operations across multiple theatres simultaneously. His 35-year reign would be characterized by almost constant warfare, as Assyrian forces pushed westward into Syria and the Levant, northward into Anatolia, and eastward into the Iranian highlands. The western campaigns that dominated the early years of Shalmaneser's reign brought Assyrian forces into direct confrontation with a coalition of Syrian and Palestinian kingdoms that recognized the existential threat posed by continued imperial expansion. The most powerful member of this alliance was Damascus, whose king Hadadezer commanded significant military resources and occupied strategic territories that controlled crucial trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast. The systematic reduction of this coalition required military operations on a scale that dwarfed previous Assyrian campaigns, involving multiple army groups operating in coordinated fashion across hundreds of kilometers of contested territory. The Battle of Karkar in 853 BC represented the largest military engagement of Shalmaneser's reign, and demonstrated both the impressive scale of Assyrian military capabilities and the desperate determination of their enemies to halt imperial expansion. The coalition assembled to oppose Assyrian advance included forces from Damascus, Israel, Hamath, and numerous smaller kingdoms throughout Syria and Palestine, creating an army that contemporary sources claim numbered more than 60,000 warriors. This unprecedented concentration of military power reflected the recognition among Western rulers that individual resistance to Assyrian expansion had proven futile, requiring coordinated action by all threatened parties. The Assyrian army that advanced toward Karkar represented the culmination of military development that had begun during the dark centuries following the late Bronze Age collapse. Infantry formations equipped with standardized iron weapons and armor provided the backbone of Assyrian strength, while cavalry units offered mobility and striking power that could exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. Siege equipment transported by specialized units enabled the reduction of fortified positions, while logistical capabilities supported operations at unprecedented distances from the Assyrian heartland. The battle itself unfolded according to tactical principles that had been refined through decades of successful campaigns against diverse enemies throughout the region. Assyrian forces deployed in carefully coordinated formations that maximized their advantages in equipment, training, and leadership, while minimizing the numerical superiority enjoyed by the coalition forces. Infantry units advanced in disciplined ranks protected by archers and supported by cavalry charges that disrupted enemy formations and created opportunities for decisive breakthrough attacks. Despite claims of victory and royal inscriptions, the Battle of Karkar appears to have resulted in a tactical stalemate that prevented immediate Assyrian conquest of Damascus, while demonstrating the formidable military capabilities that the empire could deploy when challenged. The coalition forces, though suffering heavy casualties, maintained sufficient cohesion to withdraw in good order and continue resistance to Assyrian expansion. This outcome required Shalmaneser to modify his strategic approach, adopting a more gradual process of territorial conquest that isolated individual enemies rather than confronting large coalitions simultaneously. The subsequent campaigns against Damascus extended over more than a decade and demonstrated the relentless persistence that characterized Assyrian military doctrine. Rather than attempting to capture the city through direct assault, Assyrian forces systematically destroyed the agricultural infrastructure and commercial networks that supported Damascus's economy and military capabilities. Irrigation systems were demolished, crops were burned, and trade routes were disrupted through the establishment of permanent military bases that controlled key transportation corridors. The siege techniques employed against Damascus incorporated all the innovations that had been developed during previous campaigns, including massive siege towers that overtop the city's defensive walls, battering rams that could breach the strongest fortifications, and undermining operations that threatened to collapse entire sections of the defensive perimeter. The systematic nature of these operations reflected the professional competence and technical expertise that distinguished Assyrian forces from their enemies, who relied primarily on courage and determination rather than sophisticated military engineering. The eventual submission of Damascus around 841 BC removed the most significant obstacle to Assyrian expansion in the Levant and established imperial control over territories that provided access to Mediterranean trade networks and Anatolian mineral resources. The integration of these conquered territories into the imperial administrative system required modifications to existing governmental structures, as the cultural diversity and geographical extent of the empire exceeded anything previously attempted in Mesopotamian history. The northern campaigns conducted simultaneously with the western expansion brought Assyrian forces into contact with the kingdom of Urartu, a powerful state centered in the Armenian highlands that controlled important mineral resources and trade routes connecting Anatolia with the Iranian plateau. The Urartians possessed military capabilities that rivaled those of Assyria, including sophisticated metallurgical techniques, advanced fortification systems, and cavalry forces that could operate effectively in the mountainous terrain of their homeland. The conflicts with Urartu required tactical adaptations that reflected the unique challenges of mountain warfare, where traditional Assyrian advantages in siege equipment and cavalry operations were diminished by difficult terrain and extreme weather conditions. Assyrian forces had to develop new logistical capabilities for maintaining supply lines across high mountain passes, while adapting their equipment and tactics to conditions that differed dramatically from the river valleys and plains where they had achieved their greatest successes. The artistic propaganda that emerged during Shalmaneser's reign reflected the unprecedented scale and diversity of imperial military operations, with palace reliefs depicting campaigns in exotic locations against enemies equipped with unfamiliar weapons and employing strange tactical formations. These visual narratives served educational purposes for military commanders, while providing impressive displays of imperial power for diplomatic audiences. The systematic documentation of military techniques, equipment, and geographical features provided valuable intelligence for future campaigns, while creating artistic traditions that would influence Mesopotamian art for centuries. The road networks constructed to support military operations and administrative control represented one of the most significant achievements of Shalmaneser's reign, creating communication systems that enabled centralized control over territories extending from the Iranian plateau to the Mediterranean coast. These roads followed carefully surveyed routes that minimized travel time while providing defensive advantages through the strategic positioning of fortified way stations and supply depots. The engineering expertise required for such construction demonstrated the sophisticated technical capabilities that Assyrian civilization had developed through centuries of military and commercial experience. The death of Shalmaneser III in 824 BC had initiated a period of internal strife and territorial contraction that lasted nearly 8 decades. The succession disputes weakened central authority and enabled provincial rebellions throughout the Assyrian Empire. By 745 BC, the once mighty imperial machine had been reduced to controlling little more than the traditional heartland around Ashur and Nineveh, while former vassal states reasserted their independence and rival powers encroached upon territories that had been under Assyrian dominion for generations. The accession of Tiglath-Pileser III to the throne marked not merely the end of this period of decline, but the beginning of revolutionary transformations that would establish Assyria as the most efficient military and administrative power the ancient world had yet witnessed. The man who assumed the name Tiglath-Pileser III upon his coronation was likely not a member of the traditional royal lineage, but rather a military commander named Pulu, who had seized power through a palace coup that eliminated the previous dynasty. This background as a professional soldier rather than hereditary monarch profoundly influenced his approach to imperial governance, as he possessed intimate knowledge of the military and administrative weaknesses that had enabled the recent period of Assyrian decline. His reforms addressed these systemic problems with a thoroughness and sophistication that transformed every aspect of imperial organization. The military reforms implemented by Tiglath-Pileser III represented the most comprehensive reorganization of armed forces since the innovations of Tiglath-Pileser I 4 centuries earlier. The traditional system of provincial levies and seasonal campaigns that had characterized earlier Assyrian warfare was replaced by a professional standing army that could maintain continuous operations throughout the year. This transformation required fundamental changes in recruitment, training, equipment, and logistics that created military capabilities far exceeding anything previously achieved in Mesopotamian history. The new recruitment system drew soldiers from throughout the empire, rather than relying primarily on Assyrian citizens, creating ethnically diverse military units that combine the specialized skills of different populations under unified command structures. Aramaean horsemen provided cavalry capabilities that exploited their traditional expertise in mounted warfare, while mountain peoples contributed knowledge of guerrilla tactics and siege techniques developed through generations of defensive warfare. Phoenician and other coastal populations supplied naval expertise that enabled Assyrian operations in riverine and maritime environments. The standardization of equipment and training throughout these diverse forces required unprecedented organizational capabilities that reflected the sophisticated administrative systems developed during the preceding centuries. Centralized armories produced uniform weapons and armor according to specifications that ensured consistent quality across all military units, while specialized training facilities provided instruction in tactics, equipment maintenance, and military engineering. The systematic nature of this military education created professional competence that distinguished Assyrian forces from the irregular militias and tribal levies that constituted most contemporary armies. The siege warfare capabilities that emerged from these reforms achieved levels of sophistication that made virtually no fortified position impregnable to sustained Assyrian assault. Engineering units equipped with standardized siege equipment could rapidly construct the specialized machinery necessary for reducing defensive fortifications, while coordinated infantry and cavalry operations prevented enemy forces from interfering with siege operations. The systematic approach to fortress reduction reflected accumulated experience from hundreds of successful sieges conducted throughout the empire's expanding territories. The integration of iron weapons technology reached complete maturity during this period, with Assyrian metalworkers achieving production capabilities that could equip entire armies with superior weapons and armor. Specialized workshops located in major cities throughout the empire produced standardized spear points, sword blades, and arrowheads that maintained consistent quality while incorporating technological innovations developed through continuous experimentation. The systematic exploitation of iron ore deposits in the Zagros Mountains and Anatolian highlands provided the raw materials necessary to maintain this unprecedented level of military production. The administrative revolution that accompanied these military reforms transformed the provincial system that had governed conquered territories since the time of Ashurbanipal II. The traditional practice of ruling through local vassal kings who maintained nominal independence while acknowledging Assyrian suzerainty was systematically replaced by direct imperial administration that eliminated intermediate authorities and established unified control over all aspects of provincial governance. This transformation required the development of administrative capabilities that could manage diverse populations across vast geographical distances while maintaining consistent policy implementation. The new provincial governors appointed to replace vassal rulers were drawn exclusively from the Assyrian nobility or proven military commanders who possessed both the competence and loyalty necessary for effective imperial administration. These officials received extensive training in legal procedures, taxation systems, and communication protocols that enabled them to implement consistent policies regardless of local conditions or cultural differences. Regular inspection tours by royal commissioners ensured that provincial administration met imperial standards while providing opportunities for policy adjustments based on local circumstances. The systematic replacement of local administrative personnel with Assyrian appointees extended throughout the governmental hierarchy, creating unified command structures that connected village-level officials directly to the imperial capital. This administrative integration required the development of sophisticated communication systems that could transmit orders and information across the empire's vast territories while maintaining the security and reliability necessary for effective governance. Professional messenger services operating along established routes provided regular contact between provincial centres and the imperial capital, while emergency communication systems enabled rapid response to developing crises. The legal codes implemented throughout the reformed provincial system established uniform standards of justice that replaced the diverse local traditions that had previously governed conquered populations. These standardized legal procedures provided predictable frameworks for commercial transactions, property disputes, and criminal justice that facilitated economic development, while reducing the potential for local conflicts that might threaten imperial stability. The systematic training of judicial officials ensured consistent application of imperial law throughout the empire's diverse territories. The taxation systems developed to support the expanded imperial administration represented significant innovations in fiscal organization that generated unprecedented revenues while maintaining economic productivity in conquered territories. Rather than relying solely on tribute payments and irregular levies that had characterized earlier imperial finance, the new system implemented standardized tax assessments based on agricultural productivity, commercial activity, and population levels that provided predictable income streams for imperial expenditures. The deportation policies that had been employed sporadically during earlier reigns were systematized and expanded into comprehensive population transfer programs that served multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The systematic relocation of skilled craftsmen, agricultural specialists, and administrative personnel from conquered territories to underpopulated regions of the imperial heartland strengthened Assyrian economic capabilities while weakening potential centers of resistance in newly conquered areas. These population movements were managed through sophisticated logistical operations that provided transportation, housing, and employment for relocated populations. The intelligence networks that supported these administrative and military innovations represented unprecedented developments in systematic information gathering and analysis. Professional agents operating throughout the empire and beyond its borders collected detailed information about political developments, military capabilities, and economic conditions that enabled imperial planners to anticipate threats and opportunities. This intelligence was systematically analysed and distributed to relevant officials through secure communication channels that maintained operational security while providing decision-makers with the information necessary for effective policy formulation. The Western campaigns that marked the beginning of Tiglath-Pileser's territorial expansion demonstrated the effectiveness of these military and administrative reforms through the systematic conquest of Syria and Palestine. The traditional coalition of Western kingdoms that had successfully resisted Assyrian expansion during Shalmaneser III's reign proved incapable of coordinating effective resistance against the reformed imperial war machine. Individual kingdoms were isolated and conquered through coordinated military operations that prevented mutual support while exploiting the superior mobility and firepower of professional Assyrian forces. The siege of Damascus in 732 BC represented the culmination of these Western campaigns and demonstrated the lethal efficiency of reformed Assyrian siege techniques. The city that had anchored resistance to imperial expansion for more than a century fell after a systematic siege that combined traditional assault methods with innovative engineering techniques. Massive siege towers constructed from standardized components provided platforms for archers and siege engines that dominated the defensive walls, while coordinated undermining operations threatened to collapse entire sections of the fortification system. The capture of Damascus eliminated the most significant obstacle to Assyrian control over the Levantine trade routes, and established imperial authority over territories that provided access to Mediterranean commerce and Egyptian diplomatic relationships. The integration of these conquered territories into the imperial administrative system required the appointment of Assyrian governors who implemented standardized legal and taxation systems while managing the deportation of local populations to other regions of the empire. The intervention in the affairs of Israel and Judah during this period reflected the systematic approach that characterized Tiglath-Pileser's expansion policies. Rather than attempting to conquer these kingdoms through direct military assault, Assyrian diplomacy exploited internal political divisions to establish favourable relationships with pro-Assyrian factions while isolating those elements that supported continued independence. The tribute payments extracted from these client relationships provided economic benefits while establishing precedents for future territorial incorporation. The deportation of populations from the northern kingdom of Israel, following its conquest in 722 BC, represented the largest single population transfer operation conducted during this period. Approximately 27,000 Israelites were relocated to various regions throughout the Assyrian Empire, while populations from other conquered territories were settled in the former Israelite territories. This systematic population exchange served multiple strategic objectives, eliminating potential centers of resistance while strengthening imperial control over strategically important territories. The accession of Sargon II to the throne in 722 BC occurred under circumstances that remain partially obscured by incomplete historical records, though evidence suggests that he may have been a military commander who seized power during a succession crisis, rather than a legitimate heir to Tiglath-Pileser's throne. Regardless of the specific circumstances of his rise to power, Sargon proved to be one of the most capable rulers in Assyrian history, combining military genius with administrative innovation and architectural vision that established new standards for imperial achievement. The consolidation of power that occupied the early years of Sargon's reign required the suppression of rebellions throughout the empire, while simultaneously defending against external threats from Urartu, Elam, and other rival powers. The military campaigns conducted during this period demonstrated the continued effectiveness of the reformed Assyrian war machine, while revealing areas where further improvements were necessary. The systematic nature of these operations reflected the professional competence and strategic planning that characterized the mature imperial military system. The conquest of Samaria that completed the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel represented one of Sargon's most significant early achievements, and demonstrated his ability to complete the territorial expansion programs initiated by his predecessor. The siege techniques employed during this operation incorporated all the innovations that had been developed during the preceding decades, while the subsequent administrative integration of the conquered territory followed established procedures for provincial organization and population management. The campaigns against Urartu that dominated the middle period of Sargon's reign brought Assyrian forces into conflict with the most formidable military power in the northern regions, and required tactical adaptations that reflected the unique challenges of mountain warfare. The Urartian kingdom possessed sophisticated metallurgical capabilities, advanced fortification systems, and military organization that rivaled Assyrian achievements, creating conflicts that tested the limits of imperial military capabilities. The systematic destruction of Urartian power through coordinated campaigns that targeted both military forces and economic infrastructure demonstrated the strategic sophistication that characterized mature Assyrian warfare. Rather than attempting to conquer Urartian territories through direct assault, Assyrian forces focused on disrupting the agricultural and commercial systems that supported enemy military capabilities, while establishing permanent bases that prevented the recovery of Urartian strength. The eastern campaigns against Elam and other Iranian powers extended Assyrian influence into regions that had never previously acknowledged Mesopotamian authority, and required logistical capabilities that pushed imperial organizational systems to their limits. The distances involved in these operations, combined with difficult terrain and extreme climate conditions, created challenges that required innovative solutions in transportation, supply management, and communication systems. The establishment of Dur-Sharrukin, known today as Khorsabad, represented the most ambitious architectural project of Sargon's reign, and demonstrated the unprecedented wealth and organizational capabilities that successful imperial expansion had generated. Located approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh, the new capital occupied a carefully selected site that provided excellent defensive advantages while facilitating communication with all parts of the empire. The decision to construct an entirely new city rather than expanding existing facilities reflected both practical considerations and the king's desire to create a monument that would proclaim Assyrian greatness for future generations. The scale of construction at Dur-Sharrukin exceeded even the impressive achievements of previous Assyrian building projects, with city walls enclosing an area of approximately 300 hectares and rising to heights that dominated the surrounding landscape. The engineering expertise required for such massive construction demonstrated the sophisticated technical capabilities that imperial civilization had developed through centuries of military and administrative experience. The systematic organization of construction activities employed thousands of workers drawn from throughout the empire, creating logistical challenges that required innovative solutions in housing, feeding, and coordinating diverse labor forces. The palace complex at Dur-Sharrukin established new standards for architectural grandeur that reflected both royal taste and the political requirements of imperial rule. The structure covered more than 10 hectares and contained more than 200 rooms designed for different aspects of royal administration, ceremonial functions, and private residence. Throne rooms decorated with elaborate stone reliefs provided settings for diplomatic receptions and court ceremonies, while administrative offices housed the expanding bureaucracy necessary to manage imperial affairs. The diplomatic correspondence that has survived from this period reveals the sophisticated international relationships that characterized the mature Assyrian Empire and demonstrates the systematic approach that imperial administrators adopted toward foreign policy management. Regular communication with rulers throughout the ancient Near East provided opportunities for negotiating treaties, arranging tribute payments, and coordinating military operations that advanced imperial interests while maintaining regional stability. The bureaucratic systems that managed these vast imperial territories represented organizational achievements that surpassed anything previously attempted in ancient history. Thousands of officials operating at various levels of the administrative hierarchy implemented consistent policies across diverse populations and geographical regions while maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate local conditions and cultural differences. The systematic training and supervision of these personnel ensured that imperial administration met established standards, while providing opportunities for career advancement that attracted capable individuals from throughout the empire. The assassination of Sargon II in 705 BZ during a military campaign in Anatolia sent shockwaves throughout the Assyrian Empire and created the most serious succession crisis the kingdom had faced in over a century. The death of this formidable ruler, whose body was never recovered from the battlefield, was interpreted by many subject peoples as divine judgment against Assyrian imperial ambitions. Rebellions erupted simultaneously across multiple provinces as local rulers seized what they perceived as an opportunity to throw off the yoke of foreign domination. In Babylon, the Chaldean chieftain Marduk-Apla-Iddina II, who had previously been driven from power by Sargon's forces, returned to claim the ancient throne with support from Elamite allies. Throughout Syria and Palestine, vassal kings withheld tribute payments and began coordinating resistance efforts, while in the eastern provinces, Iranian tribes launched raids against Assyrian garrisons and administrative centers. The prince who ascended to the throne as Sennacherib inherited not merely an empire in crisis, but also the most sophisticated military and administrative apparatus the ancient world had yet produced. His immediate challenge lay not in developing new capabilities, but in deploying existing imperial resources with sufficient speed and determination to prevent the complete collapse of Assyrian authority. The young king's response to these multiple crises would demonstrate both his personal capabilities as a military commander and the inherent strength of the institutional systems his predecessors had created over the preceding decades. The rebellion in Babylon posed the most serious immediate threat to imperial stability, as the ancient city's symbolic importance throughout Mesopotamia made its defection a powerful catalyst for broader resistance movements. Marduk-Apla-Iddina's return to power represented more than simple political opportunism. It embodied the deep-seated resentment that many Babylonians felt toward Assyrian domination and their systematic subordination to what they considered a culturally inferior northern kingdom. the Chaldean leader's alliance with Elam provided him with military resources that could potentially match Assyrian capabilities, while his control over Babylon's extensive commercial networks threatened to disrupt the economic foundations of imperial power. Sennacherib's initial campaign against Babylon in 703 BC demonstrated the lethal efficiency of the military machine he had inherited, while revealing the strategic complexity of governing diverse populations within a unified imperial framework. The Assyrian forces that advanced southward along the Tigris represented the culmination of military development that had begun during Tiglath-Pileser III's reforms, combining professional competence with technological superiority and logistical capabilities that enabled sustained operations far from their home bases. Infantry formations equipped with standardized iron weapons and armor formed the backbone of Assyrian strength, while cavalry units provided mobility and striking power that could exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. The siege techniques employed during the reduction of Babylonian strongholds incorporated all the innovations that had been refined through decades of successful campaigns throughout the empire. Massive siege towers constructed from standardized components provided platforms for archers and siege engines that could dominate defensive walls, while coordinated battering ram operations targeted specific weak points in fortification systems. The systematic nature of these operations reflected the professional training and technical expertise that distinguished Assyrian forces from the irregular militias and tribal levies that constituted most contemporary armies. The capture of Babylon after a prolonged siege that tested both Assyrian persistence and Babylonian resolve established Sennacherib's credentials as a military commander, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of imperial siege warfare capabilities. The systematic destruction of the city's defensive works and the deportation of significant portions of its population followed established procedures for dealing with rebellious territories, though the scale and thoroughness of these operations exceeded anything previously attempted in Mesopotamian history. Entire quarters of the ancient city were demolished, their building materials transported northward for use in Assyrian construction projects, while the surviving population was systematically relocated to various regions throughout the empire. The administrative integration of reconquered Babylonian territories required modifications to existing provincial systems that could accommodate the cultural sensitivities and economic importance of these ancient centers of civilization. Unlike the relatively straightforward incorporation of Syrian or Palestinian territories, the governance of Babylonia demanded careful attention to religious traditions, commercial relationships, and scholarly institutions that had flourished for millennia. Sennacherib's appointment of trusted Assyrian officials to key administrative positions represented a departure from previous policies that had often preserved local governing structures under imperial supervision. The Western campaigns that occupied much of Sennacherib's attention during the early years of his reign brought Assyrian forces into confrontation with a coalition of Palestinian and Phoenician cities that had coordinated their resistance efforts with Egyptian support. The most significant of these conflicts centered on the Kingdom of Judah, whose king Hezekiah had implemented extensive military preparations that included the fortification of Jerusalem and the construction of sophisticated water management systems designed to sustain the city during prolonged sieges. The famous siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC represented one of the most thoroughly documented military operations in ancient Near Eastern history, preserved not only in Assyrian royal inscriptions but also in biblical accounts and archaeological evidence that provides unprecedented insights into the realities of ancient siege warfare. The Assyrian forces that surrounded the city employed all the sophisticated techniques that had been developed through generations of military experience, establishing multiple camps that controlled all approaches, while engineers began constructing the specialized equipment necessary for reducing the fortifications. The defensive preparations that Hezekiah had implemented demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare principles and reflected the widespread knowledge of Assyrian military capabilities that had spread throughout the region. The famous tunnel system that connected Jerusalem's water sources to protected reservoirs within the city walls represented an engineering achievement that rivaled anything the Assyrians themselves had accomplished, involving the excavation of more than 500 meters of underground passages through solid rock. These preparations enabled the city's defenders to maintain adequate water supplies even during prolonged blockade, while extensive food storage facilities provided sustenance for the civilian population. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical siege operations revealed the sophisticated understanding of human motivation that characterized mature Assyrian military doctrine. Royal inscriptions describe in detail the propaganda campaigns directed at Jerusalem's defenders emphasizing the futility of resistance against imperial power while promising favorable treatment for those who submitted voluntarily. Assyrian officials fluent in Hebrew and Aramaic addressed the city's population directly, attempting to undermine confidence in their leadership while highlighting the fate of other cities that had dared to resist imperial authority. The ultimate resolution of the Jerusalem siege remains one of the most debated events in ancient Near Eastern history, with Assyrian sources claiming complete victory, while biblical accounts describe divine intervention that forced Assyrian withdrawal. Archaeological evidence suggests that the siege was indeed lifted before the city's capture, though the specific circumstances that led to this outcome remain unclear. The tribute payments subsequently extracted from Hezekiah included enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious materials that enriched the imperial treasury, while demonstrating Assyrian ability to achieve their strategic objectives even without complete military conquest. The engineering projects that characterized Sennacherib's reign represented some of the most ambitious construction undertakings in ancient history, demonstrating the unprecedented organizational capabilities and technical expertise that successful imperial expansion had generated. The most spectacular of these achievements was the transformation of Nineveh into the greatest city the ancient world had yet witnessed, a massive urban complex that served simultaneously as administrative capital, military headquarters, and architectural monument to Assyrian power. The expansion of Nineveh's defensive perimeter required the construction of walls that enclosed an area of approximately 750 hectares, making it one of the largest fortified cities in the ancient world. These massive fortifications incorporated the most advanced defensive techniques available, featuring double wall systems with intervening spaces that could trap attacking forces, while towers positioned at regular intervals provided overlapping fields of fire that could devastate any assault attempt. The gates that provided access through these defensive works were protected by elaborate approach systems that channeled visitors through multiple checkpoints, where guards could verify identities and inspect cargo. The water management systems that supplied Nineveh's expanded population represented engineering achievements that surpassed anything previously attempted in Mesopotamian urban planning. The famous aqueduct system that brought fresh water from mountain sources more than 50 kilometers away involved the construction of stone channels that crossed valleys on massive, arched bridges while maintaining precise gradients that ensured continuous flow. These engineering works required sophisticated mathematical calculations and construction techniques that demonstrated the advanced technical capabilities Assyrian civilization had developed through centuries of military and commercial experience. The royal palace complex that Sennacherib constructed at Nineveh established new standards for architectural grandeur that proclaimed Assyrian supremacy to both subjects and foreign visitors. The structure, which contemporary inscriptions describe as the palace without rival, covered more than 12 hectares and contained more than 80 rooms designed for different aspects of royal administration, ceremonial functions, and private residence. Throne rooms decorated with elaborate stone reliefs provided settings for diplomatic receptions and court ceremonies, while administrative offices housed the expanding bureaucracy necessary to manage the empire's vast territories. The artistic program that decorated these palace walls represented the culmination of Assyrian royal art, combining traditional religious themes with unprecedented celebrations of imperial military achievement. Stone relief panels carved by skilled artisans depicted scenes from Sennacherib's campaigns in minute detail, showing Assyrian forces employing sophisticated siege techniques against enemy fortifications, while captured rebels faced systematic execution. These images served multiple purposes beyond simple decoration, providing visual narratives that proclaimed imperial power while offering detailed documentation of military equipment and procedures for the instruction of future generations. The library facilities that Sennacherib established within the palace complex reflected the scholarly interests that characterized the mature Assyrian court and demonstrated the systematic approach that imperial administrators adopted toward knowledge preservation and transmission. Thousands of cuneiform tablets containing literary works, historical records, scientific treatises, and administrative documents were systematically collected from throughout the empire and organized according to sophisticated cataloging systems that facilitated scholarly research and administrative reference. The urban planning innovations that characterized Nineveh's expansion established precedents for city development that influenced Mesopotamian architecture for centuries. Wide boulevards connected major districts and provided efficient transportation routes for both commercial and military traffic. while specialized quarters housed different occupational groups and ethnic communities according to systematic organizational principles. Markets, workshops, and residential areas were positioned to maximize economic efficiency while maintaining the security considerations necessary for imperial administration. The accession of Esarhaddon to the throne in 681 BC occurred under circumstances that demonstrated both the continuing strength of Assyrian imperial institutions and the persistent challenges posed by governing diverse populations across vast geographical distances. Sennacherib's assassination by his own sons during a religious ceremony at Nineveh created another succession crisis that threatened to destabilize the empire, though the rapid resolution of this conflict revealed the effectiveness of the administrative and military systems that had been developed over the preceding decades. The civil war that followed Sennacherib's death was brief but intense, as competing factions within the royal family attempted to secure control over the imperial throne and its associated powers. Esarhaddon's ultimate victory reflected not only his personal capabilities as a military commander, but also the support he received from key elements within the imperial bureaucracy and army. The systematic elimination of rival claimants and their supporters established his authority while demonstrating the ruthless efficiency that characterized Assyrian political culture. The military reforms that Esarhaddon implemented during the early years of his reign addressed specific weaknesses that had been revealed during recent campaigns, while building upon the fundamental strengths of the imperial war machine. The integration of Arab cavalry units into standard military formations provided enhanced mobility capabilities that proved particularly valuable in desert warfare, while the systematic recruitment of siege specialists from conquered populations strengthened the technical expertise available for fortress reduction operations. The most ambitious undertaking of Esarhaddon's reign was the conquest of Egypt, a military achievement that extended Assyrian power further than any previous Mesopotamian empire and established imperial control over the world's oldest continuous civilization. The campaigns that accomplished this unprecedented feat required logistical capabilities that pushed imperial organizational systems to their absolute limits, involving the transportation and supply of large armies across hundreds of kilometers of desert terrain, while maintaining the coordination necessary for effective military operations. The initial invasion of Egypt in 674 BC encountered fierce resistance from Nubian forces under Pharaoh Taharqa, whose kingdom had established control over the Nile Valley during the preceding century. These defenders possessed military capabilities that rivaled Assyrian achievements, including sophisticated archery techniques, cavalry formations adapted to desert conditions, and defensive strategies that exploited the unique geographical features of the Nile Delta. The failure of this first campaign demonstrated that even the mighty Assyrian war machine faced significant challenges when operating in unfamiliar environments against determined enemies. The successful conquest of Egypt during Esarhaddon's second campaign in 671 BC reflected both improved tactical preparations and the systematic application of lessons learned from the previous failure. Assyrian forces adapted their equipment and procedures to desert conditions, while developing new logistical systems that could maintain supply lines across vast distances. The systematic reduction of Egyptian strongholds followed established siege warfare principles, while incorporating innovations necessary for operations in the unique environment of the Nile Valley. The administrative integration of Egypt into the Assyrian Empire required unprecedented innovations in imperial governance that could accommodate the distinctive characteristics of pharaonic civilization, while maintaining effective imperial control. Unlike previous conquests that had involved relatively similar Mesopotamian or Levantine cultures, the incorporation of Egypt demanded careful attention to religious traditions, administrative practices, and social structures that had evolved independently for millennia. The restoration of Babylon that Esarhaddon undertook during the later years of his reign represented a dramatic reversal of his father's policies and demonstrated the pragmatic flexibility that characterized successful Assyrian imperial administration. The systematic reconstruction of the ancient city's temples, walls, and public buildings required enormous expenditures of resources and labor, while serving important political objectives that strengthened imperial legitimacy throughout Mesopotamia. The death of Esarhaddon in 669 BC while campaigning in Egypt marked the beginning of what would prove to be both the cultural zenith and the political twilight of the Assyrian Empire. His carefully planned succession arrangement, which divided imperial responsibilities between his sons Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin, initially appeared to represent a sophisticated solution to the challenges of governing territories that stretch from the Iranian plateau to the Nile cataracts. Ashurbanipal received the primary throne at Nineveh with authority over the core Assyrian territories and most provincial administrations, while his younger brother was installed as king of Babylon with nominal independence but practical subordination to imperial oversight. This division of power reflected Esarhaddon's recognition that the empire had grown beyond the capacity of any single ruler to manage effectively, requiring innovative administrative arrangements that could maintain unified control while accommodating regional autonomy. The early years of Ashurbanipal's reign witnessed the continuation of aggressive military expansion that pushed Assyrian territorial control to its absolute maximum extent. The completion of the Egyptian conquest that his father had initiated required sustained military operations across the eastern Mediterranean and deep into the Nile Valley, involving logistical challenges that tested imperial organizational capabilities to their limits. The systematic reduction of Nubian resistance in Upper Egypt demanded coordination between multiple army groups operating hundreds of kilometers apart, while the establishment of effective administrative control over the ancient pharaonic territories required cultural sensitivity and political flexibility that previous Assyrian conquests had not demanded. The campaigns in Egypt during the early 660 SBC demonstrated both the impressive capabilities and the emerging limitations of the Assyrian military machine. The forces that advanced southward along the Nile possessed all the technological advantages and professional competence that had characterized imperial armies for generations, including standardized iron weapons, sophisticated siege equipment, and coordinated infantry cavalry tactics that could overwhelm traditional enemies in conventional engagements. However, the vast distances involved in Egyptian operations, combined with the unfamiliar climate and terrain conditions, created supply and communication problems that strained imperial resources while providing Egyptian resistance movements with opportunities to exploit Assyrian vulnerabilities. The revolt of Taharka's successor, Tantamani, in 664 BC revealed the fundamental weakness of Assyrian control over territories that lay beyond the practical reach of sustained military intervention. Despite the impressive victories that had established initial imperial authority over Egypt, the maintenance of effective control required permanent garrison forces and administrative personnel that represented enormous ongoing expenses while providing limited economic returns. The systematic destruction of Thebes that followed the suppression of this rebellion demonstrated Assyrian military capabilities while highlighting the costs associated with maintaining imperial authority over distant and culturally distinct territories. The eastern campaigns that occupied much of Ashurbanipal's attention during the middle period of his reign brought Assyrian forces into prolonged conflict with Elam, the ancient kingdom that controlled strategic territories along the Persian Gulf and maintained traditional hostility toward Mesopotamian expansion. These operations represented some of the most challenging military undertakings in Assyrian history, requiring sustained campaigns across difficult terrain against enemies who possessed sophisticated military capabilities and could exploit their intimate knowledge of local geographical conditions to offset Assyrian advantages in equipment and organization. The Elamite capital of Susa, with its massive defensive walls and strategic position controlling access routes from the Iranian plateau, presented siege challenges that tested the limits of Assyrian military engineering. The systematic reduction of this ancient stronghold required innovations in assault techniques and siege equipment that built upon centuries of accumulated experience while adapting to the unique defensive features that Elamite engineers had developed. Massive siege towers constructed from standardized components had to be transported across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous terrain, while battering ram operations required modifications to accommodate the distinctive masonry techniques employed in Elamite fortifications. The eventual capture and systematic destruction of Susa around 646 BC represented one of the most complete urban demolitions in ancient history, as Assyrian forces methodically dismantled not only the city's defensive works, but also its temples, palaces, and residential quarters. Royal inscriptions describe the removal of sacred statues and religious artifacts that had been venerated for millennia, their transportation to Assyrian temples, where they served as trophies demonstrating imperial supremacy over ancient enemies. The deportation of surviving populations followed established procedures for population transfer, though the scale and thoroughness of these operations exceeded previous examples of imperial demographic manipulation. The Arabian campaigns that extended Assyrian influence into the desert regions south and east of traditional Mesopotamian boundaries represented unprecedented military undertakings that required tactical and logistical adaptations to environments where conventional imperial advantages were significantly diminished. The mobile Arab tribes that controlled these territories employed guerrilla warfare techniques that exploited their superior knowledge of desert conditions, while avoiding direct confrontations with Assyrian forces. These enemies possessed no fixed fortifications that could be systematically reduced through conventional siege operations, instead relying on mobility and endurance that challenged traditional Assyrian military doctrine. The systematic pursuit of Arab tribal confederations across vast desert expanses required modifications to standard military equipment and procedures that reflected the unique challenges of desert warfare. Water supplies became the critical limiting factor for military operations, requiring the establishment of supply depots and communication networks that could maintain contact with advancing forces while providing the logistical support necessary for sustained campaigns. Cavalry units assumed greater importance in these operations, as their mobility advantages were essential for maintaining contact with enemy forces and preventing their escape to inaccessible refuge areas. The capture of Arab strongholds like Duma required siege techniques adapted to desert conditions, where traditional water-based siege warfare was impossible and conventional supply lines were vulnerable to interdiction by mobile enemy forces. Assyrian engineers developed new approaches to fortress reduction that emphasized speed and efficiency over the methodical procedures that had characterized previous siege operations. These innovations reflected the accumulated experience and technical expertise that imperial military forces had developed through centuries of warfare against diverse enemies in varied geographical environments. While these military campaigns extended Assyrian territorial control to its greatest extent, the most enduring achievement of Ashurbanipal's reign was the creation of the Great Library at Nineveh, a systematic collection of cuneiform literature that preserved the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization for posterity. This unprecedented scholarly undertaking reflected the cultural sophistication that imperial prosperity had enabled, while demonstrating the systematic approach that characterized mature Assyrian administrative capabilities. The king's personal interest in scholarly pursuits, documented in royal inscriptions that boast of his literacy and learning, provided the motivation and resources necessary for this massive intellectual project. The systematic collection of texts for the royal library involved agents operating throughout the empire who identified, copied, and transported manuscripts from temple archives, palace collections, and private scholarly libraries in major cities across Mesopotamia and beyond. This process required not only enormous financial resources, but also sophisticated organizational capabilities that could coordinate the activities of hundreds of scribes, translators, and administrative personnel. The standardization of copying procedures ensured consistent quality and accuracy, while cataloging systems prevented efficient access to the accumulated materials. The scope of the collection that resulted from these efforts encompassed virtually every aspect of Mesopotamian intellectual achievement, including literary masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh, scientific treatises on mathematics and astronomy, historical chronicles documenting the reigns of previous rulers, legal codes preserving ancient jurisprudence, and religious texts containing the mythological and theological traditions of diverse cultures. Medical texts preserved the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian physicians, while technical manuals documented engineering techniques and craft procedures that had been developed through centuries of practical experience. The physical organization of the library reflected sophisticated understanding of information management principles that enabled scholars to locate specific texts among the tens of thousands of tablets that comprised the collection. Tablets were organized by subject matter and stored in labeled containers that facilitated retrieval, while cross-reference systems connected related materials and provided comprehensive coverage of particular topics. The systematic nature of this organization demonstrated the administrative expertise that Assyrian civilization had developed through centuries of governing complex imperial territories. The scholarly activities that the library supported extended beyond simple preservation to include active research and composition that advanced Mesopotamian intellectual achievements. Royal scribes produced new historical works that synthesized information from multiple sources while providing contemporary perspectives on current events. Scientific investigations are built upon previous discoveries while incorporating new observations and theoretical developments. Literary compositions combined traditional themes with innovative approaches that reflected the cultural diversity and intellectual sophistication of the mature imperial period. However, the most serious threat to imperial stability emerged not from external enemies, but from the growing tensions between Ashurbanipal and his brother Shamash-Shum-Ukin, whose relationship deteriorated steadily as the practical limitations of their divided authority became apparent. The younger brother's position as king of Babylon had initially provided an effective solution to the challenges of governing the ancient southern territories, as his cultural legitimacy and administrative competence enabled the maintenance of local loyalty while preserving imperial unity. However, the inherent contradictions between nominal independence and practical subordination created increasing friction as Shamash-shum-ukin sought to expand his autonomous authority, while Ashurbanipal insisted on maintaining ultimate imperial control. The economic foundations of this conflict lay in the competing demands for imperial resources that resulted from the massive military campaigns and construction projects that characterized both rulers' policies. The maintenance of large armies in Egypt, Elam, and Arabia required enormous expenditures that strained imperial finances, while the construction of palaces, temples, and fortifications consumed additional resources that might otherwise have supported economic development. The tribute and taxation systems that had previously provided adequate revenues for imperial needs proved insufficient for the expanded territorial and administrative requirements of the mature empire. The systematic exploitation of Babylonian wealth to support Assyrian military operations created particular resentment among the southern populations, who viewed these extractions as evidence of their continued subordination despite the nominal independence that Shamash-shum-ukin's kingship was supposed to represent. The ancient commercial networks that had generated Babylonian prosperity for millennia were increasingly directed towards supporting imperial rather than local interests, while the deportation policies that relocated skilled craftsmen and agricultural workers to other regions of the empire weakened the economic foundations of traditional Babylonian urban centers. The ideological dimensions of the growing conflict reflected fundamental differences in political philosophy and cultural identity that had been temporarily suppressed but never resolved through the administrative arrangements that Esarhaddon had implemented. Shamash-shum-ukin's identification with traditional Babylonian political and religious traditions created expectations among his subjects that he would eventually assert complete independence from Assyrian control, while Ashurbanipal's commitment to maintaining imperial unity required the preservation of ultimate authority over all imperial territories, regardless of local arrangements. The diplomatic maneuvering that preceded open warfare involved both brothers and systematic efforts to secure allies and resources that would provide decisive advantages in the anticipated conflict. Shamash-shum-ukin cultivated relationships with Elamite rulers, Arab tribal leaders, and other traditional enemies of Assyrian expansion, offering them opportunities to weaken imperial power while advancing their own territorial ambitions. These negotiations required careful coordination and significant financial inducements that further strained the resources available for normal administrative and military operations. Ashurbanipal's response to these developing threats involved the systematic strengthening of imperial military capabilities while attempting to isolate his brother's potential allies through diplomatic pressure and military intimidation. The recall of experienced commanders from distant campaigns provided the expertise necessary for operations against sophisticated enemies, while the concentration of elite military units in Mesopotamian garrisons demonstrated imperial determination to maintain unity at any cost. Intelligence networks that had been developed for external operations were redirected toward monitoring internal threats and providing early warning of rebellious activities. The outbreak of open warfare in 652 BC marked the beginning of a devastating civil conflict that would consume imperial resources and weaken Assyrian military capabilities for years to come. The initial phases of the conflict revealed the fundamental military advantages that Ashurbanipal possessed through his control over the core imperial territories and the loyalty of professional military units that had been trained and equipped according to standardized imperial procedures. However, Shamash-shum-ukin's alliance with external enemies and his support among significant portions of the Babylonian population created a formidable coalition that could exploit Assyrian vulnerabilities while presenting multiple simultaneous threats. The siege warfare that characterized much of this conflict demonstrated both the advanced state of Assyrian military engineering and the enormous costs associated with reducing fortified positions defended by forces possessing comparable technological capabilities. The systematic reduction of Babylonian strongholds required the same sophisticated siege techniques that had proven successful against foreign enemies, but the defenders' familiarity with Assyrian methods and their access to similar equipment created prolonged operations that consumed resources while providing limited strategic benefits. The emergence of new external threats during this period of internal conflict revealed the extent to which imperial overextension had created vulnerabilities that opportunistic enemies could exploit. The Medes, an Iranian people who had been consolidating power in the Zagros Mountains during the preceding decades, began systematic raids against Assyrian territories while imperial forces were concentrated in Mesopotamia dealing with the civil war. These attacks demonstrated sophisticated military organization and tactical capabilities that suggested the emergence of a new regional power capable of challenging Assyrian supremacy. Similarly, the Babylonian resistance movements that had been developing under Chaldean leadership found new opportunities to advance their territorial ambitions, while Assyrian attention was focused on the immediate crisis of imperial unity. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain who would eventually establish the Neo-Babylonian Empire, began consolidating control over southern Mesopotamian territories through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic alliances that exploited the temporary weakness of imperial authority. The death of Ashurbanipal around 627 BC marked the end of the last effective Assyrian ruler and initiated a catastrophic period of internal collapse that would destroy within 2 decades an empire that had dominated the ancient Near East for over 3 centuries. The succession crisis that followed his death exposed the fundamental structural weaknesses that had developed during the later imperial period, as competing claimants to the throne lacked both the personal authority and institutional support necessary to maintain control over the vast territories that stretched from the Iranian plateau to the Egyptian border. The civil war between Shamash-Shumukin and Ashurbanipal had already severely weakened imperial military capabilities and financial resources, while the systematic exploitation of provincial populations had created widespread resentment that external enemies could exploit to advance their own territorial ambitions. The immediate succession dispute centered on conflicting claims between Ashur-etil-Ilani and Sin-Shah-Ishkun, both sons of Ashurbanipal whose legitimacy was disputed by various factions within the imperial court and military establishment. Neither candidate possessed the overwhelming support that would have enabled rapid consolidation of authority, creating a prolonged period of uncertainty during which provincial governors and military commanders were forced to choose sides without clear guidance regarding the ultimate outcome. This internal division provided opportunities for ambitious regional leaders to assert increasing independence while maintaining nominal loyalty to whichever claimant seemed most likely to prevail. The fragmenting imperial administration proved incapable of responding effectively to the multiple challenges that emerged simultaneously across different regions of the empire. In Egypt, the native dynasties that had been suppressed during the Assyrian conquest began reasserting their authority over territories that lay beyond the practical reach of sustained military intervention. The enormous costs associated with maintaining garrison forces along the Nile had always strained imperial resources, while the limited economic benefits derived from Egyptian control made these territories particularly vulnerable to abandonment when more pressing threats emerged closer to the Mesopotamian heartland. The eastern provinces that bordered the Iranian plateau faced increasing pressure from the Median Kingdom, whose rulers had been systematically consolidating their control over the Zagros Mountains, while developing military capabilities that could challenge Assyrian supremacy in conventional warfare. The Medes possessed sophisticated metallurgical techniques that enabled the production of high-quality weapons and armor, while their cavalry forces were particularly well adapted to the mountainous terrain that had traditionally provided Assyria with defensive advantages against eastern enemies. The systematic coordination of Median tribal confederations under centralized royal authority created a unified military force that could sustain prolonged campaigns against Assyrian border fortifications. More significantly, the emergence of Nabopolassar as the dominant Chaldean leader in southern Mesopotamia created a direct threat to the core territories that had provided the foundation for Assyrian imperial power. Unlike previous Babylonian resistance movements that had relied primarily on local support and limited external assistance, Nabopolassar's forces possessed both the military capabilities and strategic vision necessary to challenge Assyrian control over the ancient cities that controlled crucial trade routes and agricultural resources. This systematic consolidation of Chaldean tribal territories provided a secure base of operations that could support sustained military operations against Assyrian strongholds throughout the region. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied these military developments fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout the ancient Near East, as traditional enemies of Assyrian expansion recognized the opportunity to coordinate their efforts against a weakening imperial structure. The alliance between Nabopolassar and the Median king Cyaxares represented a strategic partnership that combined Babylonian knowledge of Mesopotamian geography and fortification systems with Median military capabilities and Iranian tribal manpower. This coalition possessed both the resources and coordination necessary to mount sustained campaigns against the core Assyrian territories while preventing imperial forces from concentrating their defensive efforts against individual threats. The systematic nature of this anti-Assyrian alliance reflected sophisticated understanding of imperial vulnerabilities and strategic planning that exploited the overextension that had characterized Assyrian territorial expansion during the preceding century. Rather than attempting to achieve rapid territorial gains through individual campaigns, the Allied forces coordinated their operations to maintain continuous pressure on multiple fronts while preventing Assyrian commanders from deploying their limited resources effectively. The timing of attacks was carefully synchronized to maximize the strain on imperial communication and supply systems, while minimizing opportunities for coordinated defensive responses. The military campaigns that began around 626 BC demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Assyrian professional forces when properly led and supplied, and the fundamental weakness of imperial defensive capabilities when faced with coordinated attacks across multiple theatres. The siege of Babylon by Assyrian forces attempting to suppress Nabopolassar's rebellion revealed that imperial siege warfare techniques retained their technical sophistication, with engineers constructing elaborate assault works that incorporated all the innovations developed during centuries of successful fortress reduction operations. However, the simultaneous pressure from Median forces in the east prevented the concentration of sufficient resources to achieve decisive results. While the extended duration of siege operations consumed supplies and manpower that could not be easily replaced, the failure to recapture Babylon represented more than a simple military defeat. It demonstrated to observers throughout the empire that Assyrian power was no longer irresistible, and that sustained resistance could achieve success against imperial forces. This psychological transformation proved as significant as any tactical development, as provincial populations that had previously submitted to Assyrian authority out of fear began calculating the potential benefits of rebellion against the probable costs of continued loyalty. The systematic withdrawal of tribute payments and the increasing frequency of local uprisings created a cascade of administrative failures that further weakened imperial capabilities. The economic foundations of imperial power, which had been strained by decades of expensive military campaigns and massive construction projects, proved inadequate to support the sustained warfare necessary to suppress multiple simultaneous rebellions. The tribute systems that had provided the financial resources for imperial administration and military operations depended upon the maintenance of effective control over productive territories, but the very rebellions that required expensive military responses also eliminated the revenue sources necessary to fund those operations. This vicious cycle of declining resources and increasing expenses created insurmountable fiscal problems that no amount of administrative efficiency could resolve. The systematic destruction of Assyrian trade networks during this period eliminated another crucial source of imperial revenue while disrupting the commercial relationships that had connected Mesopotamian cities with markets throughout the ancient Near East. Median control over mountain passes that connected Assyrian territories with Iranian mineral resources prevented the importation of raw materials necessary for weapon production. While Babylonian dominance over southern Mesopotamian cities disrupted the agricultural systems that provided food supplies for urban populations and military forces, the cumulative effect of these economic disruptions created shortages that undermined both military effectiveness and civilian morale throughout the remaining imperial territories. The alliance between Babylon and Media achieved its most spectacular success with the systematic siege and ultimate destruction of Nineveh in 612 BC, an operation that required unprecedented coordination between diverse military forces and sophisticated logistical capabilities that demonstrated the advanced organizational skills that Assyrian enemies had developed through decades of warfare against imperial forces. The combined armies that surrounded the great capital possessed siege equipment and assault techniques that rivaled anything the Assyrians themselves had employed during their centuries of territorial expansion, including massive battering rams, mobile siege towers, and coordinated undermining operations that could breach even the most formidable defensive works. The Siege of Nineveh revealed both the impressive defensive capabilities that Assyrian engineers had incorporated into the capital's fortifications, and the ultimate limitations of passive defensive strategies when faced with sustained assault by technically competent enemies possessing superior numbers and resources. The massive walls that Sennacherib had constructed to protect the city incorporated multiple defensive lines with elaborate gate systems and tower networks that could theoretically withstand any conventional assault. But the systematic nature of the Allied siege operations gradually overcame these advantages through the application of overwhelming force and technical expertise. The engineering techniques employed during the siege demonstrated that Assyrian enemies had not merely learned to copy imperial military methods, but had developed innovations that could overcome traditional Assyrian defensive advantages. Median engineers constructed elaborate earthworks that enabled their siege equipment to operate at the same level as the city's defensive walls, while Babylonian specialists employed water diversion techniques that undermined the foundations of key defensive positions. The coordination required for such complex operations revealed the sophisticated command and communication systems that the Allied forces had developed specifically for this campaign. The systematic destruction that followed the city's capture exceeded even the most brutal examples of Assyrian conquest policy, as the victorious allies sought to eliminate not merely Assyrian military capabilities, but the very foundations of imperial civilization. The great palaces that had housed the royal court and administrative bureaucracy were systematically demolished, their carved stone reliefs smashed, and their building materials scattered or transported to other cities as trophies of victory. The famous library of Ashurbanipal, containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that preserve the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamian civilization, was buried beneath the rubble of collapsed buildings, where it would remain hidden until modern archaeological excavations revealed its treasures. The temple complexes that had served as centres of Assyrian religious life faced particularly thorough destruction, as the Allied forces sought to eliminate the theological foundations that had provided ideological justification for imperial expansion. The great temple of Ashur, which had been the spiritual heart of Assyrian civilization for more than a millennium, was systematically dismantled, and its sacred objects distributed among the victorious armies as symbols of their triumph over traditional enemies. The systematic nature of this religious destruction reflected sophisticated understanding of the role that theological concepts had played in maintaining imperial unity and the determination to prevent any revival of Assyrian political identity. The population of Nineveh faced systematic deportation and dispersal that employed the same techniques the Assyrians themselves had used to prevent rebellions in conquered territories. Skilled craftsmen, administrative personnel, and military specialists were relocated to various regions throughout the victorious kingdoms, where their expertise could contribute to the reconstruction and development of areas that had suffered under imperial exploitation. The remaining population was scattered among numerous small communities where they could be more easily supervised and prevented from maintaining the cultural cohesion necessary for organized resistance. Despite the catastrophic loss of their capital and the systematic destruction of imperial administrative systems, remnants of Assyrian military and political leadership attempted to maintain organized resistance from the western city of Harran, where Ashur-Uballit II had established what remained of royal authority with support from Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Necho II. This final attempt at Assyrian revival reflected both the desperate determination of imperial loyalists and the continued strategic importance that foreign powers attached to maintaining some form of Assyrian presence as a counterweight to growing Babylonian and Median power in Mesopotamia. The Egyptian support for this Assyrian remnant represented a significant shift in the strategic calculations that had governed international relations throughout the region for centuries. Previous pharaohs had viewed Assyrian expansion as a direct threat to Egyptian independence and had frequently supported anti-imperial coalitions, but the complete collapse of Assyrian power created new concerns about the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The emergence of strong Babylonian and Median kingdoms posed potential threats to Egyptian interests that might prove more dangerous than the weakened Assyrian state that Ashurbanipal II represented. The military capabilities that the Harran-based Assyrian remnant could deploy remained formidable despite the disasters that had destroyed the imperial heartland. As significant numbers of professional soldiers and experienced commanders had escaped the destruction of Nineveh and maintained their organizational cohesion under royal leadership. These forces retained their superior equipment, tactical training, and siege warfare expertise, while Egyptian support provided additional resources and strategic depth that enabled sustained resistance against the Allied forces that sought to complete the destruction of Assyrian political identity. The siege of Harran in 610 BC demonstrated that Assyrian military capabilities retained their effectiveness even under the desperate circumstances that characterized this final phase of imperial resistance. The defensive preparations that Ashur-Uballit II implemented incorporated all the sophisticated techniques that had been developed through centuries of siege warfare experience, including multiple defensive lines, protected water supplies, and coordinated artillery positions that could devastate attacking forces. The systematic nature of these preparations revealed that Assyrian military engineering retained its technical excellence despite the catastrophic political and economic circumstances that surrounded this final stronghold. However, The overwhelming numerical superiority and coordinated assault techniques that the Babylonian-Median alliance could deploy ultimately proved decisive against even the most skillful defensive preparations. The systematic reduction of Harran's fortifications required prolonged siege operations that demonstrated both the persistence of the Allied forces and their ability to maintain complex military operations at considerable distances from their home bases. The engineering capabilities that enabled the construction of elaborate siege works and the coordination of multiple assault columns reveal the sophisticated military organization that Assyrian enemies had developed through their successful campaigns against imperial forces. The final destruction of Harran and the death or disappearance of Ashur-Uballit II around 609 BC marked the definitive end of Assyrian political independence and the completion of a process of imperial collapse that had consumed less than 2 decades. The systematic elimination of Assyrian administrative centres, military installations and population concentrations ensured that no significant revival of imperial power would be possible, while the deliberate destruction of cultural and religious institutions prevented the maintenance of distinct Assyrian identity that might have supported future independence movements. The thoroughness of this destruction reflected the accumulated resentment that centuries of imperial domination had created among the diverse populations that had suffered under Assyrian rule, as well as the strategic calculation that complete elimination of Assyrian capabilities was necessary to prevent any future challenge to the new political arrangements that were emerging throughout the region. The systematic nature of population dispersal and cultural destruction employed techniques that the Assyrians themselves had perfected during their centuries of territorial expansion, creating a bitter irony in which imperial methods were turned against their creators with devastating effectiveness. The speed and completeness of Assyrian imperial collapse demonstrated the fundamental instability that had developed within the political and economic systems that had supported territorial expansion for more than 3 centuries. The overextension of military commitments, the exploitation of provincial populations, and the concentration of resources in expensive prestige projects had created vulnerabilities that coordinated enemies could exploit once the personal authority and institutional effectiveness of imperial leadership began to decline. The systematic destruction of Assyrian cities and the dispersal of their populations ensured that the political and cultural foundations of imperial power were eliminated so thoroughly that no significant revival would ever be attempted. The complete destruction of Harran and the elimination of the last vestiges of Assyrian political authority did not mark the end of Assyrian civilization itself, though it fundamentally transformed the nature of Assyrian identity and cultural expression. Scattered throughout the territories of the former empire, significant populations of Assyrian heritage survived the systematic campaigns of destruction and deportation that had eliminated their political institutions. These communities, dispersed across northern Mesopotamia, the Syrian highlands, and various regions where imperial policies had relocated them during previous centuries, maintained their distinct linguistic and cultural traditions despite the absence of unified political leadership or territorial control. The survival of Assyrian populations in their traditional heartland around the ruins of Ashur, Nineveh, and Kalhu proved particularly significant for the preservation of cultural continuity. While the great cities lay in ruins and their administrative functions had been permanently destroyed, the agricultural settlements and smaller urban centres that had supported imperial civilization continued to function under the new political arrangements established by Babylonian and Median authorities. These communities preserved not only the Aramaic dialects that had become the common language of imperial administration, but also the technical knowledge and craft traditions that had sustained Assyrian material culture for centuries. The gradual conversion of these surviving Assyrian populations to Christianity during the early centuries of the Common Era represented a fundamental transformation in religious identity that paradoxically strengthened their cultural cohesion and provided new foundations for community organization. The adoption of Christian theological concepts and ecclesiastical structures offered alternatives to the traditional religious institutions that had been destroyed along with the imperial political system, while the emphasis on scriptural literacy and theological education preserved intellectual traditions that might otherwise have been lost during the centuries of political fragmentation. The development of distinctive Assyrian Christian communities during the Parthian and Sassanid periods demonstrated remarkable cultural resilience and adaptability. These populations maintained their ancestral languages while adapting Christian liturgical practices to their particular cultural circumstances, creating religious traditions that combined universal Christian theological concepts with specifically Assyrian cultural expressions. The establishment of major Christian centres at locations like Nisibis and Edessa provided institutional frameworks that could preserve and transmit cultural knowledge across generations while adapting to changing political circumstances. The scholarly activities that flourished within these Christian communities played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Assyrian Christian scholars translated classical texts from various ancient languages into Aramaic and later Arabic, ensuring that scientific, philosophical, and literary works that might otherwise have been lost continued to influence subsequent intellectual development. The famous school of Nisibis became a major centre of learning that attracted students from throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and preserved knowledge that would later contribute to the Islamic Golden Age. The monastic traditions that developed within Assyrian Christianity provided particularly effective mechanisms for cultural preservation and transmission. Monasteries established in the mountainous regions of northern Mesopotamia and the Syrian highlands maintained libraries and scriptoria where ancient texts were copied and preserved, while the disciplined scholarly activities of monastic communities ensured that traditional knowledge remained accessible to future generations. These institutions served functions analogous to those that the great libraries of imperial palaces had provided, though their religious rather than political orientation enabled them to survive the periodic political upheavals that characterized the region during subsequent centuries. The impact of Assyrian administrative, military, and cultural innovations on successor empires extended far beyond the immediate geographical boundaries of the former imperial territories, influencing governmental practices and military organization throughout the ancient Near East for centuries after the collapse of Assyrian political authority. The Persian Empire that emerged under Cyrus the Great and his successors adopted numerous administrative techniques that had been pioneered by Assyrian imperial bureaucrats, including standardized provincial organization, systematic communication networks, and population transfer policies that facilitated the integration of diverse ethnic groups within unified imperial structures. The Persian adoption of Assyrian governmental practices reflected practical recognition of their effectiveness, rather than simple cultural borrowing, as Persian administrators encountered many of the same challenges that had confronted their Assyrian predecessors in governing vast territories containing diverse populations with different languages, religions, and cultural traditions. The provincial system that the Persians implemented throughout their empire incorporated organizational principles that Assyrian administrators had developed through centuries of practical experience, including the appointment of governors with comprehensive authority over designated territories, the establishment of regular communication networks connecting provincial centres with the imperial capital, and the systematic collection of tribute and taxation according to standardized procedures. The military innovations that had characterized Assyrian imperial expansion similarly influenced the development of Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman military organization, though these successor powers adapted Assyrian techniques to their own particular strategic requirements and cultural preferences. The systematic use of siege warfare equipment, the integration of diverse ethnic groups within unified military commands, and the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and specialized units in combined arms operations all reflected lessons that later military commanders had learned from studying Assyrian tactical methods and strategic approaches. The Roman military system that emerged during the Republican and Imperial periods incorporated numerous elements that could be traced directly to Assyrian precedents, including the systematic use of engineering units for siege operations, the establishment of permanent military bases that could support sustained campaigns in distant territories, and the integration of auxiliary forces drawn from conquered populations. Roman military manuals and tactical treatises frequently referenced examples from Assyrian military history, indicating the continued relevance that professional soldiers attached to studying the methods that had enabled Assyrian forces to dominate the ancient Near East for centuries. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged following Alexander's conquests similarly adopted administrative and military practices that reflected Assyrian influence, though the Greek cultural orientation of these states created distinctive synthetic approaches that combined Mesopotamian governmental techniques with Greek philosophical and artistic traditions. The systematic documentation of governmental procedures, the establishment of professional bureaucracies, and the coordination of military and civilian authority within unified imperial structures all demonstrated the continued practical value of organizational innovations that Assyrian administrators had developed. The rediscovery of Assyrian civilization through 19th and 20th century archaeological excavations represented one of the most dramatic recoveries of lost historical knowledge in the modern era, revealing the sophisticated achievements of a civilization that had been largely forgotten except for fragmentary references in biblical and classical sources. The systematic excavation of major Assyrian sites began during the mid-19th century when European archaeologists recognized the historical significance of the massive artificial mounds that marked the locations of ancient cities throughout northern Mesopotamia. The pioneering excavations conducted by Austin Henry Layard at Nineveh and Calhoun during the 1840s and 1850s uncovered spectacular palace complexes with elaborate stone relief sculptures that provided the first modern insights into the artistic achievements and historical narratives of Assyrian imperial civilization. These discoveries captured public imagination throughout Europe and North America, as the detailed depictions of ancient warfare, royal ceremonies, and daily life offered unprecedented glimpses into a vanished world that had previously been known only through brief and often hostile references in biblical texts. The systematic excavation techniques that archaeologists developed for investigating Assyrian sites established methodological standards that influenced archaeological practice throughout the world. The careful documentation of architectural remains, the systematic recording of artifact distributions, and the development of stratigraphic analysis techniques enabled researchers to reconstruct detailed sequences of cultural development that reveal the evolution of Assyrian civilization over more than a millennium. These methodological innovations proved particularly important for understanding the complex relationships between different phases of occupation at major sites where continuous habitation had created deep archaeological deposits. The discovery of the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh provided access to tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that preserve the literary, scientific, and administrative records of Assyrian imperial civilization. The systematic translation and publication of these texts required the development of new scholarly disciplines and international collaboration among specialists in ancient languages, history, and archaeology. The Epic of Gilgamesh, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, historical chronicles, and legal codes recovered from the library revolutionized understanding of ancient Mesopotamian intellectual achievements while providing detailed documentation of Assyrian governmental practices and cultural values. The excavations at Dur Sharukin, conducted by French archaeologists during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed the remarkable urban planning and architectural sophistication that had characterized Sargon II's new capital. The systematic investigation of the palace complex, temple areas, and residential districts provided comprehensive insights into the organization of an Assyrian royal city, while demonstrating the advanced engineering capabilities that had enabled the construction of such massive architectural projects. The discovery of detailed sculptural programs and inscriptional evidence illuminated the ideological foundations of imperial authority, while revealing the artistic traditions that had influenced subsequent Near Eastern cultures. The continuing archaeological investigation of Assyrian sites during the 20th and 21st centuries has employed increasingly sophisticated techniques that have refined understanding of Assyrian civilization while revealing previously unknown aspects of imperial organization and cultural development. Remote sensing technologies, computer-assisted analysis of architectural remains, and scientific dating methods have enabled researchers to reconstruct detailed chronologies of site development while identifying subtle changes in material culture that reflect evolving social and economic conditions. The modern Assyrian diaspora represents a remarkable example of cultural persistence and adaptation, as communities descended from the ancient populations of northern Mesopotamia have maintained their distinct identity while adapting to life in countries throughout the world. The political upheavals and religious persecutions that have affected the Middle East during the modern era have forced many Assyrian families to seek refuge in Europe, North America, Australia, and other regions where they have established new communities while preserving their ancestral languages and cultural traditions. The preservation of Assyrian languages within these diaspora communities demonstrates extraordinary linguistic tenacity, as speakers of Neo-Aramaic dialects have maintained oral traditions that can be traced back through centuries of cultural transmission to the ancient Aramaic that served as the administrative language of the Assyrian Empire. These modern languages preserve grammatical structures, vocabulary elements, and phonological features that provide direct connections to the linguistic heritage of ancient Mesopotamia, offering invaluable resources for scholars studying the development of Semitic languages and the cultural continuity of Middle Eastern populations. The establishment of Assyrian cultural organizations, educational institutions, and religious communities throughout the diaspora has created networks that connect geographically dispersed populations while preserving traditional practices and knowledge systems. These institutions organize cultural festivals, language instruction programs, and scholarly conferences that maintain community cohesion while adapting traditional practices to contemporary circumstances. the systematic documentation of oral traditions, folk customs, and historical memories within these communities has preserved cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the traumatic dislocations of the modern era. Contemporary efforts to maintain Assyrian cultural identity amid regional conflicts have required innovative approaches that combine traditional preservation methods with modern communication technologies and international advocacy networks. Digital archives and online platforms have enabled the documentation and dissemination of cultural materials that can reach Assyrian communities worldwide, while preserving endangered dialects and traditional practices for future generations. These technological approaches have proven particularly valuable for maintaining connections between communities separated by vast geographical distances, while providing educational resources that can support cultural transmission within families and local organisations. The academic study of Assyrian history and culture continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries and analytical techniques reveal previously unknown aspects of this remarkable civilization. International scholarly collaboration has enabled comprehensive approaches to Assyrian studies that integrate archaeological evidence with textual analysis, comparative historical research, and anthropological investigation of contemporary communities. These multidisciplinary approaches have enriched understanding of Assyrian achievements while demonstrating their continued relevance for comprehending the development of human civilization. The legacy of Assyrian civilization extends far beyond its immediate historical period, influencing governmental practices, military organization, artistic traditions, and intellectual development throughout subsequent history. The administrative innovations that enabled the management of vast multicultural empires provided precedents that influenced imperial organization for millennia, while the systematic documentation of knowledge and the preservation of intellectual traditions established patterns of scholarly activity that continue to characterize academic institutions throughout the world. The ultimate significance of Assyrian civilization lies not merely in its military conquests or architectural achievements, but in its demonstration of humanity's capacity to create sophisticated institutional systems that can integrate diverse populations while preserving cultural knowledge across generations. The survival of Assyrian communities and the recovery of their historical achievements through modern scholarship testify to the enduring power of cultural identity and the importance of preserving the diverse heritage of human civilization for future generations. The story of Assyria, from its humble origins as a trading city on the Tigris to its emergence as the world's first truly global empire, and from its catastrophic collapse to the persistence of its people and traditions into the modern era, represents one of history's most compelling narratives of human achievement, adaptation, and survival.